Okay, welcome to the last day of our program. As usual, we start with the plenary session. It's a pleasure to introduce today's invited speaker, Hugues Bersini. Hugues Bersini is a professor at the Università Libre de Bruxelles, and there is also co-director of IRIDIA, the Artificial Intelligence Research Laboratory. He is also a member of the Belgium Royal Academy of Science. There is a long list of research areas in which he is active. For instance, modeling and control of complex systems, neural networks and fuzzy control, data, graph test mining, autonomous agents and dynamics of biological networks, immune engineering, and many more. In these areas, he is author of hundreds of scientific articles and dozens of books. The title of the talk is Why? While the whole should be less than the sum of the parts. Okay, thanks to be here.
Thank you. So I think I have to press something here. Right, okay. Can you hear me okay? Right, so for the Italian of you, grazie di avermi invitato. My only words in Italian. And then I will move in English. I've been told that I'm supposed to have 1 hour. What I've decided to do, let me see if everything is working on the slides thing. All right. Okay. What I have decided to do, you can see everything over, is to basically split my talk in 2 parts. You will have 2 talks instead of 1 for the price of 1. You get 2. And everyone will be, I think, will last half an hour. So I've been told that I have 1 hour. And the first one will be very practical. And I could have entitled it UML for IBM. And a very engineering talk, computer science kind of talk. And the second one will be much more philosophical. And they both has to do with complex system modeling, which is something I'm interested in. So you're going to hear about economical modeling, immune system modeling, climate modeling. So you're going to see a lot of complex system modeling, which is the reason I'm here. But I will first tackle a very practical issue, how to simulate complex system. And then the second part will be more philosophical about this notion, which is highly debated and a very confusing notion of emergence. This is the reason why you have this title. You know, often emergence is associated with this, you know, famous expression, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So this is the reason why I'm a bit provocative, telling that not, in theory, the whole should be less than the sum of the parts. So if you're interested, we can discuss, and I'll be very happy to have your reaction. Philosophy is much better to interact, to discuss that sometime computer science. So first talk, half an hour, hopefully. So what happened is that I think, and I'm happy to see Philippe and Mathieu here, because I guess I was invited to give a very similar conference nearly 10 years ago, even more. And at the time I gave a talk on an economical modeling, because like Philippe, I'm interested in economical modeling. It was a talk, and I'll say something about the model later on, but just to introduce this UML for IBM. It was a talk where I was describing a model and trying to understand how and why an economy should be competitive, and why an economy should be just random, you know. And it was a kind of very funny and very pedagogical model that I showed to the audience, like you. And showing my model, you know, I think the model at the time was written in Java. Showing the model, I show a lot of diagrams, which, you know, I'm teaching object orientation for 30 years, which was my main topic of teaching at university in Brussels. So I show a lot of diagrams during my talk, UML diagrams, you know, class diagrams, sequence diagrams, state transition diagrams, and which are the classical UML diagram, which I'm using a lot. It turns out that UML is a bit less popular than it used to be nearly 20 years ago when it has been invented, but yet, you know, I still believe that it is a useful kind of thing. So I was showing the diagrams. And I remember in the audience there was, I think it was Nigel, I think is the name of this very influential man in agent-based modeling, came to see me and told me, what is this kind of diagram? You know, I've never seen those diagrams in my life before. And in my model, there was a lot of human being acting, agent, economical agent, and doing things. And so there was sellers, consumers, producers, you know, a kind of complex modeling with different type of agents. And everything was illustrated by a class diagram. And he told me, well, what is that? You know, it's interesting because you describe the way you model exactly like we do in agent-based modeling, but you're not using the same kind of graphical techniques that we used. And I realized that we were speaking about similar things, but taking two very different perspectives. You know, I was a very, computer scientist, you know, using object orientation, which is, you know, what I've been teaching to do and what I'm teaching to do. And but we're doing something different. And he asked me, Nigel asked me, oh, could you write something, you know, in order to, a kind of very pedagogical article in order to match agent-based modeling and UML. And I did it, and this paper had a little impact, and I received a lot of interaction with this community agent-based modeling. So I think the floor is still open for discussion. So this is the first part of the talk. I still believe that object orientation and UML is an important way to, even design and simulate complex system modeling. And in this paper, I use the famous, for just didactical reason, you know, I use the famous Thomas Schelling, ghetto model that you're all familiar with, which is, by the way, is an interesting one because you can also use it for emergence, because often Thomas Schelling is when he was alive, he was also using this model to speak about emergence. And if you remember that ghettoization model is the fact that, you know, you have a bunch of agents who'd like to have only a homogeneous neighborhood, you know, in a neighborhood people like at least a certain minimum of people like them, and if they're not like them, they just move randomly. And with this, it's a very interesting phenomena which give rise to ghetto and some of these clustering things. And in order to, you know, it was not, the model was very well famous, but in order to, just teach UML, I put everything in a UML form. But I put this book because this is a kind of a very well-known book in France for teaching object orientation, because it's really my main topic of teaching in my university. So you see a classical class diagram, and in the Schelling model you have three classes basically. You have the world, the agent, and the site, you know, the place. And so I will not surprise anyone familiar with UML. And what is really interesting also is that you can use a sequence diagram to explain everything that happened in this model. So if you see, do you see my mouse when I move it? Okay. So you see that the world will ask the agent to move, and for the agent to move, the agent first needs to assess the neighborhood. Exactly. It's a very simple model, simplest model you can imagine. And they just look at the neighborhood, and if the neighborhood doesn't possess enough of that same color, they would decide to move. And in order to move, they will just find a random site, and then they will move to this random site. And you can explain everything without typing a line of Java, Python, and which is exactly the benefits of UML, you know. So in this article, I just presented this sequence diagram and class diagrams. And there was this whole idea that, you know, the reason why UML has been created is to avoid using programming language, avoid using Java, avoid using Python, and the interesting thing is when I was discussing with my colleagues of agent-based modeling, at the end they can use some programming language, because this is the programming language we've been taught in university, you know, like Java, Python, whatever, C#, C++. But because this is the language they need to use, so and UML really map on those language, because you even have automated generation tool. I'm using some of them, which some of them are working even pretty well. You can draw your diagram in UML, and you can generate any kind of programming language you want. And this exercise of UMLization of natural science and complex system modeling, I played this exercise many times with different communities. And it's so very interesting, because this is another experience I had with immunologists. I made my PhD with a very famous biologist called Francisco Varela, who passed away 20 years ago, and I did an immune system modeling together with him. And at the time, you know, when I was reading the, you know, immune book, there was a kind of sentence that you could find in the immunological book. You don't even need to read it. The antigen, whatever, T cell, are helped by co-receptors, and MHC, cytotoxics. You know, the immune system is a rather complex material. But if you take this sentence, you know, you can easily translate it in a class diagram. And you can see this class diagram is exactly a replica of, obviously the immunologists will never use it, but if you want to make a Java, C# whatever modeling of the immune system, this is the intermediary level which is very necessary, because that kind of diagram, a biologist will easily understand it. And you know that T cell possesses a receptor, but you have two types of receptor, and those two types of receptor interact with what is called MHC molecule. In fact, you have two types of MHC molecules, and that is typical immunology. And the computer scientist will understand that too, you know, because it's a class diagram, and you can translate it in Java and Python. And then you have a lot of interesting issues. I don't want to get into the debate right now, but you know, for instance, a biologist will tell you that a CD8 is a subclass of receptor. But then you can ask yourself if it's really a subclass in terms of object orientation. You know, the definition of subclassing in object orientation is very specific, and I don't think biologists have exactly the same meaning in mind when they speak about subclass. But you can raise a discussion with the biologists when you try to model the biological systems, and this is what I've done, and at the end I've done a lot of biological simulation. And interestingly enough, again in that story, when I was interested in immune system modeling, I met a woman called Véronique Thomas-Valin who was using agent-based modeling for doing exactly the same thing. So again, we had these two possibilities, you know, agent-based modeling. She was doing that. She's a very famous biologist, acquainted with computer science because she's doing some kind of agent-based modeling. And I was doing UML and whatever. So we also had this discussion. At the end, I won because she now used the UML, and we worked together by using these UML things. And another example of that. Last but not least example I'd like to give is 2-3 years ago, I met a climate modeler, a Swiss guy, who developed a very interesting climate modeling, which is one of the most popular climate modeling, mostly when you want to, you know, teach climate modeling, and above all, the warming effect. And this is a model developed in Switzerland called BERN, see Switzerland, SCM. And that model is like, often, like a lot of climate modeling is done in Fortran, right? It's done in Fortran, and interestingly, climate modeling and computer science have a very common history together. You know, Van Neumann himself, you know, created computer for first climate modeling and then trying to optimize the effect of, as you know, the atomic bomb. But climate modeling was a very key thing, and if you go back to the Princeton story, you see that there was a lot of discussion issue on climate modeling. So climate modeling is a very key part of computer science history. And if you think about climate modeling, they're done in Fortran. And they're very complex, all right, because we're trying, in that case of modeling, we're trying to understand the production of CO2, you know, which is the famous, famous gas who is responsible for the warming effect. And this is a very bunch of equations, but I'm not going to explain you. I'm not even an expert in that. It's done in Fortran, and you have a lot of equations. But you have equation related with the water, equation related with the atmosphere, equation related with the Earth. So you have these component things, you know, but they put all together in Fortran. So the exercise I asked some of my researchers to do is to, again, make it in an object-oriented form. So take the Fortran code, split it, use the normal argument of object orientation, split it apart, take the different components, and see how the climate people will react, you know. And we did this exercise, and it's an interesting exercise to be done because you realize this is some kind of comparison in the execution time and in the length of the code. And the first thing my computer scientist student did was to translate that in Python. He took the Fortran code and put it in Python. Obviously Python, you can do it procedural, you can do it object-oriented. He did it object-oriented because I asked him to do object-oriented code. So he did it object-oriented, and the time of running time exploded. Boom! Python 10,000 times slower than the Fortran code. So it's pretty hard to go to a climate scientist and tell, look, I've done a very, progress in your code. No, I have new code, which is written in a very modern language. Forget about Fortran. Fortran is 50 years old, so who cares about Fortran? Do it Python, because university students know they only know Python, so do it in Python. But, you have a little price to pay, 10,000 slower. And obviously the climate guy, and I have this interaction and say, okay, this is a very simple code, but if I have to wait, 1 century in order to see if the Earth is going to warm in 1 year from now, this is a pretty bad news, can't you do better? So I didn't exactly know if it was due to the object orientation of Python, so I asked my student to do it in Python in a procedural form, because Python can also be procedural. So it was a perfect match between the Fortran and the Python code, but yet again it was 10,000 slower. So it was not so much the object orientation aspect, it was Python. So okay, we had discussion, and I say, okay, forget Python, go to C++. Okay, it's the same problem, because C++, the climatologists, they don't know C++. They don't know C++, they all program in Fortran. Some of them do a little bit differently, but most of them program in Fortran. So we did it in C++, and at least in C++, what we realized is that, okay, the running time, you see, it's, if you compare C++ and Fortran, we're running in similar time. So you can do your code in C++, the same climate modeling code, and you can do it in object-oriented form. The problem with object orientation is that if you look now with the Fortran original code, and if you keep it procedural, you see that you have exactly the same, so this is the code length, you have exactly the same number of lines. It's not a big code, it's 2,000 lines. If you're a computer scientist, it's not a very big code. But if you transform it in object-oriented form, you double the number of lines. And it's classical, when you do object orientation, you have to split your code, and you have to create class where you don't have class, and you split it. So now I am in a discussion, and it's a very important discussion, because we all depend on the climate modeling. You know that climate modeling and software for climate modeling is a very highly debated thing. In France, in Belgium, in Italy, there are a lot of people criticizing climate modeling software because there is too much uncertainty. And so what I'm trying to sell to the climate modeling people is exactly the good lessons of object orientation. It's more transparent, it's easier to play with, it's easier to manage, it's more stable. If I succeed to convince those guys, I think it's one of the most sensitive community doing software modeling. I haven't succeeded yet. Right now, they're just indifferent. I keep having mails, sending mails, and ask them, read the code. Obviously, it's C++. I can't do object orientation with Fortran. Sorry, Fortran is not done for that. So I ask them, read the code, discuss with your community, and see if you see some advantage to that. So we're in the middle of the process. So I cannot give you a final answer to that, but just to tell you that, this whole debate is keep moving on. There are a lot of computer scientists who also adopt UML. There's one of my favorite colleagues called David Harrell. David Harrell is the one who invented the state transition diagram, which is a very interesting UML diagram. He used the state transition diagram to model cell. I'm not gonna, it's a long story, so I just want you to know that I'm not the only computer scientist mapping UML to complex modeling, like David Harrell, who is an Israeli scientist, very famous one, is doing cell modeling, is a fantastic computer scientist, doing cell modeling only with state transition diagram, And behind there is some kind of C++ being generated automatically, but he's done that in that form. And you see the kind of a model, if you are a little bit familiar with cell, it's cell proliferation, cell differentiation, everything is done by a state transition diagram. I don't want to spend too much time with that. Together with David Harrell, we've proposed a way to create a code out of a state transition diagram. So when you have a state transition diagram and you want to translate it into Java or C++ or whatever, an object-oriented code, we have invented, David and we have invented a way of doing so. If you're interested, there are papers telling so. The paper in fact, when Philippe invited me, we had this discussion. The paper that I was mentioning initially was a paper that was trying to differentiate two kinds of economy. Because I'm not an economist, Another history, you know, when I try to understand something, I want to simulate it. I don't know if you have exactly the same kind of, you know, a habit, but if I don't simulate, I don't understand. Climate, no, I start to understand. Biology, I understand a little bit, and which is the good things of being a computer scientist, you know. You have this universal possibility to simulate things, because at the end, everything is information and process. So something I never understood was a trade-off that I kept listening, a trade-off in economy between, you know, efficiency and equality. This is a famous trade-off in economy. People tell you, if you want to have a very efficient economy, at the end, you will raise a lot of inequality, but the economy will be efficient. Well, on the other hand, if you want to be very egalitarian, like perhaps communist, whatever, you will have a very low efficiency in economy. So this trade-off, I never understood it. So I decided to try to understand it, and for that I made a model, and I presented this model in this famous paper where, in fact, Nigel told, I don't understand anything about your class diagram, but that was done in a class diagram model where I compare two kinds of model. So again, I will not be, I won't go in large in that, because also, as I said, I want to split it equally in two parts. But I made a model where you had agents here that can be producer. The agent can produce things, they can consume things, they can sell and they can buy. Okay, so agents can have four attitudes: produce things, consume things, sell and buy. And I imagine two types of markets. One market that should favor efficiency, which is highly competitive. And that market was a double auctioning market. In fact, this is the kind of market that Philippe Mathieu has also developed in some of his papers before. A double auction market is a market where the sellers and the buyers compete in order to sell their product. You know, they have to compete. The sellers obviously will compete by lowering the price, and the buyers will compete by, you know, making higher bid proposal, and when they cross, that is the competitive economy. You have another possibility, which is a random economy. Just to give you an example of how could be a random economy with respect to a competitive economy. My favorite example could be eBay. eBay, as you know, there's some auctioning part in eBay. If you're interested in something, you have to auction in order to buy the things. You know, there's some kind of competitive process going on. You could imagine another kind of eBay. In fact, I program it also, which is another kind of, which to some extent would be much more egalitarian. This other kind of eBay would be, okay, no, I put the product I want to sell, I have a reserve price. Let's say I want to sell, I take an example, I have a good guitar, but I want to sell it. But at least I'd like to have 100 euros of my guitar. It's a second-hand guitar, I want to have 100 euros. And you just put that on it. And then there are people making offers, but you don't care their offers, okay? You just want the offers to be superior to the reserve price. And you select randomly a buyer. There could be a buyer proposing 10,000 euros because he loves that guitar. And there could be one a bit more poor that can only propose 120 euros. In my simulation, they both have the same chance to acquire the guitar in the end. It's a very egalitarian economy, if you want, you know. So that was the two types of economy I simulated, and I made it in a, and in general, you know, there's a lot of confusion about this equality. What does that mean, equality? What does that mean, efficiency? This is the type of things which are often go together with this notion of equality and efficiency. So I made my simulation. I'm going to, you know, this is where the trade-off is. There is a very interesting book by Arthur Okum, who really raised the issue of this trade-off between equality and efficiency. And you can see the sentence: if both equality and efficiency are valued and never takes absolute priority over the other, then in place where they conflict, compromise ought to be struck. In such case, some equality will be sacrificed for the sake of efficiency and some efficiency for the sake of equality. So you really realize that there is a kind of a you know, trade-off. And in fact, the metaphor that this famous economist, he was the, back in time in the 70s, he was the right arm of the, I don't remember the American president. He was a very famous economist back in time. And he took the metaphor of the leaky bucket. You know, when you want to reestablish equality, you lose a bit of your water because, you know, you lose efficiency. So I made simulation, and if you're really interested in the details of the simulation, I have no time to jump into. But the competition model I used was the double auction, which is a perfect concurrential model, because the buyers and the sellers, they really have to fight in order to sell their product, while the equalitarian one is just random, so there's no competition taking place. And this is description of my simulation. I don't want to bother you with some technical details. The competitive economy was a classical double auction, and the random economy was just a random pairing of the sellers and the buyers, a little bit like the eBay thing that I was describing before. And every agent could produce, sell, buy, consume, and then agent had welfare, money, taste, and skills. And this is the quantities that describe the happiness. So the happiness of the agent is related with his welfare. The richness of the agent is related with his money. And taste and skills are interesting because taste will determine the consumer behavior, while skill will determine the producer behavior. The skiller you are, the less the price when you sell the product, And the more taste you have for the product, the better, the happier you become when you consume this product. So you have a bit of the philosophy of the model behind. And so the agent can, produce and sell. The skills will, determine the way they produce, and the taste will determine what happens when they consume. And so there is an iterative model. At every time step, a transaction can occur, and the transaction can be either competitive or random. And at the end of the day, I'm going to jump some of the thing. At the end of the day, what I realized, and this, at least I could understand something about economy, what I realized is that in a very egalitarian economy, you basically have a low Gini. If you're a little bit about the economists, obviously more equality. But what you have is a low aggregate utility. So in general, you have a society where everyone is happy, but happy the same. So you have a society where, imagine two people in that society. In the egalitarian, that was given by my model. In a kind of random economy, if you have a society with two people, they will be happy 4, 5. For instance, one will be happy 4 and one will be happy 5. In total, they will be happy 9. Well, if you take a competitive economy, you have a society with two people, but one will be happy 1 and the other will be happy 10. So there will be a very large gap between the happiness of both. But in aggregation, the society will be more happy. And because just the competitor can become very happy, by this economy, that provide them a lot of benefit of that, So it's hard to trade off between that, because what is the better society? A 4-5 or 1-10? It's highly debatable. Another very interesting lesson that I never understood, and I need to use this model, was the Hayek idea, which is a very old idea, that competition needs to take place for the price to play the information role. Price, as you know, is a way to inform the producer that they have to produce this piece. I never understood that before this model. I'm stupid, I didn't know anything about the economy, but with this model, what happened in that the competitive economy, you had a lot of market failure. In the random economy, you had a lot of market failure. The consumer didn't find the product they liked because the producer were not inclined, were not stimulated to produce the thing that the consumer wanted, which is really the role of competition, at least to my understanding, and perhaps I might be wrong on that. And there's an interesting, and then I will move to my second talk because it's just half. There's an interesting anecdote, a story that economists liked a lot. When you suppose you have a snow crisis in Aquila, and there's been unfortunately, there's been a lot of crises in Aquila, but suppose you have a snow crisis in Aquila, and there's a lot of snow, and people need to, get rid of that snow. And, but there's not enough, how do you call it, I think, shelves, this is the name of it. You don't have enough shelves, okay? And then, it's a problem because you don't have enough shelves, but we are in a competitive economy, so there is one hardware seller, and you have few shelves, and because we are in a competitive economy, he decided that the shelf price will increase, because this is basically what economy is about. And if you ask the layman, even if you ask it to me, you say, is that moral? is that fair, you know, to raise the price of a shelf, which is the most needed thing at a certain crisis time? This is a thing people, you know, this is a story being told to the people in the street. 95% of the people, it's a statistic which is well known, will say, no, it's disgusting. It's fully unfair, you know, to raise the price of a very, you know, desired product at the time of a crisis. 95% will say, yeah, this competitive economy is really immoral, unfair. But yet, you know, what happens is that the next time you have a crisis, what an economist will tell you is that the next time there is a crisis, because shelves are becoming, you know, so expensive to sell, next time there will be much more shelves, because the information is that you need shelves, and the producer will produce shelves because it gains money with that, you know. So you see this debate about the random economy and the competitive economy. Use UML diagram and you can have at least a way to play it. And I'm playing with this model. If you're interested in this model, you can play with it, and you can move a trade-off and go to a very competitive economy or to a very random economy. And interestingly enough, in a lot of websites that perhaps you used, like eBay, like Vinted, my wife is using a lot of Vinted, etc. You see that there's still this trade-off, you know, how to negotiate the price between the seller and the buyer. And it's not all auctioning. If you look at those websites, there are some auctioning ones, but there are some of them which are not the first to serve. There's a lot of interesting way to deal your website. Right. Second part, the whole is less than the sum of the part. As I was, you know, warning you, this one is a bit more philosophical than the first one. The first one was very practical, you know, computer science oriented, whatever. This one is a bit more philosophical. So, you know, I've done myself a lot of conference on artificial life, and back in time, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, emergence was one of the most popular, you know, kind of a scientific concept or philosophical concept, you know. And people were discussing what is emergence, you know, what is this whole which is more than the sum of the parts. You know that in A life, like in agent-based modeling, you have a lot of complex system modeling, you have a lot of things happening on the whole, which is somewhat different from what's happening on the parts. So I wrote, and this is a paper that I'm going to defend here, I think there is a way to defend a strong vision of emergence, and there's only one scientific discipline which can, you know, allow to do so, and it's biology. So I'm going to try to tell you and to convince you that biology has a way to defend a certain strong form of emergence. Because right now, everything I've shown to you is only a weak form of emergence, because everything is go back to the parts, you know. Whoever, you know, the Schelling model, my economical modeling, my immune system modeling, they all weak form of emergence, because you simulate the part and you have the whole. Okay, but the whole is fully reducible to the part. And I do think that science is like that, you know, you need to simulate the part in order to understand the whole. So this is why I believe that the emergentism is an anti-scientific attitude. I think scientists should be reductionists, which is a strong claim, you know, there are a lot of people who disagree with that. But I do believe that science is about reductionism. And so, but yet, you know, can we still defend some form of strong emergence? And you see that I have a way with biology to do so. And one of the reasons why I'm also interested in that, in my lab, we're doing a lot of swarm robots. You may have seen those videos. I'm heading this lab with Marco Dorigo, he's an Italian, working together with me in Iridia. And we're doing a lot of swarm robotics, where I'm going to show you a video later on. We use a lot of robots. Those robots alone, they're stupid. They can't do anything, like insects. But when they join them, you have an interesting behavior emerging, if I can allow that. But the reality is, whenever I was presented some of the results I had in my lab and I was showing the robots, I often have someone in the room asking me, would you call that an emergent behavior? You know, the fact that the robots decide to join, for instance, for going over the gap, you know, is that an emergent behavior? And this has made me thinking about it, you know. I say, yeah, perhaps it is emergent, but with what meaning? This is what I'm going to try to defend here. So the first thing for me to define emergence is to, there is emergence, weak, strong, in the middle, whatever, when at least you need to define two observers. One that I call MIG-Jim and one that I call MAG-Jim. MIG-Jim is looking at the part, MAG-Jim is looking at the whole. So MAG-Jim is an observer which has the possibility to integrate in time and in space the whole things. Like when you look at the computer screen, and you see this interesting cellular automata making things. This is MacGym. You know, MacGym is the guy who code in Java or in Python the way every cell is behaving. You know, so this is MacGym and MacGym. And emergence start, at least the discussion on emergence start, when MacGym and MacGym are not speaking about the same language. There is a kind of semantic gap between MacGym and MacGym, right? So for instance, very daily situation, there is a traffic jam, and MacGym is in the car, and he's trying to avoid the jam and doing a lot of, you know, can you imagine a highway in Italy during the vacation, so people are trying to avoid and then you have the helicopter with someone commenting what's happening in the road, and this is MacGym saying, you know, look at the line is moving 1 kilometers per hour. This is an emergent phenomena, even if the people driving the car is trying to do their best to avoid the jam. Obviously, in my lab, we invented the ant colony optimization algorithms, and ant colony is a classical also emergent phenomena for many people because ant, they're not aware of taking the shortest path. But if you have a colony of ant, and if the ant just obey to 2 actions, you know, deposit a pheromone, and whenever you have a bifurcation, taking the road with the highest gradient of pheromone, just 2 rules, but no one is taking a map saying this is a short path and this is a long path. The ants don't care the length of the path. At the end, you have all ants converging to the shortest path. And this is what MacGym is seeing, obviously. A last example is neural network. Neural network is full of emergence, if you want, and one of my favorites is the Hopfield neural network, which is less popular now that was incredible deep neural network that really break my balls, you know, these deep learning things, you know, which is just a revival of everything we've heard in the 50s, then in the 70s, then in the 80s. It's incredible. When you're old, you know, it's just this deep neural network fashion is incredible, you know. And, but yet, it's emergent to some extent. But my favorite neural network is still the Hopfield one, where you could code memories even if none of the neurons realize that they code a memory, you know, and if you know about the Hopfield neural network, you know that the memory is just a fixed point, and so the whole neural network converges towards things that they can memorize. MacGym is seeing the numbers here that you can memorize, while MacGym is the neuron. MacGym is the neuron, and MacGym is seeing the patterns. You know, again, you have this semantic gap, 2 languages, the languages of MacGym and the languages of MacGym. Mic for micro, Mac for macro. And as I was telling before, science has to take a strong claim. Again, I forgive for that. Science has to stay reductionist. We need to modestly stay reductionist. And then I just put on the side everything that, according to me, is not even science, you know, like vitalism, creationism. And there's even this problem of the mind-body problem. You need to know that emergence was very popular at the end of the 19th century by English philosophers discussing about consciousness. Because for them, consciousness was something more than the sum of the neuronal activity. They want to see a gap between consciousness and neurons. I can agree with that. You know, this is another kind of debate, you know, and I don't have a clue to say about this debate about is consciousness really grounded in the brain, or, you know, this hard, easy problem of consciousness. You certainly, if you're interested in neuroscience, you may know this problem. But I see that different from the emergence problem. You know, I see it's 2 different philosophical problems. You know, you can speak emergence without dealing with consciousness, without dealing with vitalism, etc. And in fact, you have a lot of examples of emergent phenomena like all the cellular automata. One, you know, this is in my community back 20 years ago, the artificial life community. I can't tell you the number of papers asking if the glider of the game of life, which is one of the most popular cellular automata, is it emergent or not? There's a lot of papers about that. The glider, is it emergent? You know, glider is not programmed in the game of life code, you know. There's nowhere the glider being programmed, you know. But you have the glider moving, you know. So is the glider emergent? And Marc Bedeau and Stuart Kaufman, you'll see there's a lot of people discussing that. So this is what interests me, this kind of thing. No consciousness, no vitalism, no whatever, because this is not science. And with my friend Francisco Varela back in time, we did a lot of cellular simulation. This is the autopoietic simulation, which is one I like very much. And you could simulate a cell, you know, and and is this emergent or not? We also had the same kind of discussion. Pierluigi Luisi, who is a very interesting Italian biologist in Roma, wrote a book called The Emergence of Life. You see, for him, you know, the emergence of cell is something that you have to call emergent. You have to use this expression emergence for describing it. So, as I was telling you, you know, when I was being asked, you know, are your robot emergent? I'm going to show you a simulation now that you may know if you have seen that before. This is what we're doing in my lab. This is a very old video, but I still like it. You know, the robot alone will just fall in the gap. And then he decided to call a friend, because otherwise he will die. And he called a friend, and they just joined together. And they called themselves by lightning, you know, they lightning, and so there's many more sophisticated version of it right now, but this is still a very interesting one for emergent. And you see that together, they go over the gap. Obviously, alone they don't, together they can do it. So, is going over the gap an emergent phenomenon? And remember that those robots have been highly inspired by social insects, you know, and social insects are doing a lot of interesting things together, collectively, like ants, like termites, like birds, like fish. They're doing a lot of things collectively, you know, we even call them social insects. And so when I was showing those kind of video, there was often people asking me, and again, I repeat myself, are these emergent? And you know, I say, no, look at that, everything is known, you know, we programmed that, we know exactly what happened, so why should we call it emergent? But I was just asking to myself, but in the case of a real insect, you know, suppose that the robot is a real organism, then I think that biology has something to tell us that physics can't tell. And if you think about the robot, there is two ingredients that need to be, you know, added in order to explain the behavior of the robots. Obviously, they are the part, the robots, that connect, but why do they decide to connect? They decided to connect because there are two things that we need to add in the whole reasoning. The first one is the gap. You have a certain environment which, according to me, is playing the role of MAGGIM. One of the big problems with emergence is the subjectivation of MAGGIM, you know, because MAGGIM is a human, you say, no, this is a weak form of emergence, you know, because MAGGIM is a scientist, so he has seen the things, but at the end, he knows that everything can be reduced down to what MAGGIM is doing. So as long as MAGGIM is a human, he can be surprised. There was even a definition of emergence back in 20 years ago, done in my community alive, where the title were, there is emergence when you surprise. That was definition. How do you define surprise, you know? The glider was surprising, I guess, to John Conway the first time we've seen it. But once you have understood how the glider is being programmed, are you surprised any longer? So, you know, this reducing emergence to kind of surprising things, I don't like this idea of putting things into human. So I prefer to desubjectivize the whole things. And here, you have a way to desubjectivize the things, is the gap. The gap explains why the robot needs to connect, you know. But not only the gap. If the robot don't connect, they die. So there is the gap, and there is a third ingredient, which is natural selection. In biology, you have a key ingredient, which is natural selection, which doesn't exist in physics. You don't need, and you'll see there's a lot of interesting things about that discussion, you don't need natural selection in physics. You can do physics without natural selection. You can't do biology without natural selection. And in fact, most of what we do in my lab for programming those robots is by using genetic algorithms, which is a good coincidence, you know, because we use those evolutionary inspired type of algorithms in order for the robot not dying. And so, I mean, you know, how can you strengthen the emergence, you know, because there's the possibility of a weak emergence. I don't deny that, you know. I'm surprised, it's interesting, the ghetto from Schelling, the glider from the cellular automata, the trade-off equality, efficiency. They are collective things. They are weakly emergent in my sense, in the sense that, you know, you can reduce everything down to the part. Strong emergence is the idea that you have an ontological gap, like consciousness, etc., but we still need to keep scientists. So is there any way to strengthen? Yes, I think biology helps here. And because in biology, if you look a little bit the theory of biology, you in general have two types of explanation. You have a proximate cause and you have the ultimate cause. And the ultimate cause is to some extent the engineering vision of biology. You know, why physics is telling how, natural selection is telling why. And this why need to integrate as the third ingredient, you know, you have both, it's important, you know, in order to strengthen this emergence, you need those three ingredients, you know, the part, the integrative environment, and the theory of natural selection. This is what you can see in this, here you have the, you know, the part connecting and doing those nonlinear things, whatever we want to do. You have the integrating environment, which is here the gap, and you have the natural selection filter, okay? Now I'm gonna let you hear for 5 minutes. This is, according to me, one of the most important scientists in the complex system. You might recognize him as Stuart Kaufman. And he's still very active. It might be very old now because I met him during our first conference in Artificial Life. And I'm going to let you hear Stuart Kaufman, but before that, for 2 or 3 minutes, I'm getting close to the end of the talk. As you see, this is the flocking birds. You have a lot of simulation of the flocking birds. This is very classical, very typical, etc. I have some of my friends in France who are physicists and who are simulating the flocking birds. And it's interesting because they do it in a physical way. What I do mean by doing it in a physical way, as a real physicist. What they do, they take movies of real birds. There's a lot of nice flocking birds, you know, that you can take movies from. And they do simulation. And they try to put some mathematical equations, and you know that the birds need to follow some local rules. This is what's interesting in the bird. They have to follow some local rules. And what the physicist is usually doing is trying to map the parameters of his equations in order to match the reality he's recording, you know. He's trying to make the simulation as close to the reality by, you know, tuning the parameters. And in fact, I have some good friends in France doing exactly so. What they don't do at all is to integrate natural selection. Birds are not flying like that by chance. They decide to fly in the way they fly because this provides them with some natural selection advantage. You can imagine, you know, that the birds, you know, they collect in a certain way because this is being carried by the wind. So they take advantage of this integrated environment. They also might decide to fly in this way because they can escape predation. You know, there's a lot of predation, and so the birds. And if you integrate the natural selection and all those things, you know, the predator, the wind, then you have another discourse. And you may exactly find the same parameters that the physicist found, but by doing it in a biological way, you see? And then this is why I believe that biology differentiates from physics. And this is, to some extent, what Stuart Kaufman is telling
Well, I'll say one more thing about emergence.
I hope you can hear that.
We all have hearts. I don't want to doubt that a fine physicist like Steven Weinberg, who's a reductionist, could in principle explain all the properties of my heart if you gave him all the parts of the heart. It's not so easy. They can't even get to the Navier-Stokes equations for fluid motion. So it's not obvious that this is doable, but let's grant it to them. Here's what I think the physicist cannot do. He or she cannot either deduce or simulate the coming into existence in the biosphere by natural selection and Darwinian pre-adaptations that I'll get to in a moment, of structures such as the heart, which are complicated, highly organized processes that manage to pump blood. And I don't think that the physicist has a prayer of doing that, given all the quantum events in the universe. So I think that hearts are emergent and they have causal consequences, so I think they're ontologically real. So the universe is not just particles in motion, it's also hearts beating and feet walking and a couple in love on the bank.
So what Stuart was saying, and it takes not long, is saying that a physicist can understand heart, by Navier-Stokes equation, etc., but it doesn't tell you why heart. What is the ultimate causes of heart, which is to pump blood, etc. So it's exactly the same. It's not easy to formulate, but we have exactly the same kind of vision of, what should, what biology can tell about emotions. And it's interesting because there is sometimes because they need it, there's an interesting biological simulation where for instance, there's a lot of people trying to understand chemical reaction networks with a lot of equations. And in order to find the parameters of equations, they put some kind of optimization there. For instance, optimizing the production of a certain metabolite. And so they put a function into the equations, they use an optimization algorithms, and then they deduce the right parameters. So they do it because they realize that this is the best way to fit the parameters. So the fact of putting natural selection inside and optimization algorithms, according to me, what make, again, biology somewhat different from physics, because, physics can do without that, but biology needs that, and that is where there is a strengthening of this notion of emergence. So, and I'm going to close to conclusion, and I hope perhaps there will be discussion about this two-part, even if this one is more debatable than the first one. The first one is computer science. The second one is highly debatable. Emergence is not such a sexy topic any longer, even in my community, A life. We're not so much discussing that. There seems to be, I don't know. I still like the topic, and I still try to give a definition to a conceptual definition to emergence. There is a debate in biology which is still strong about things like natural selection. And if you remember what I'm telling, this is my last slide, so if you remember what I'm telling, I need to understand the collective behavior of the group in order to, understand how the individual behave, because there is a group effect in my definition of emergence. You remember, the robot is a group of robots, the bird is a group of birds, and I need to take the group into account. There is a very hot topic in biology, which is not emergence, but which is group selection versus individual selection. And it's a very hot topic. In fact, Richard Dawkins is one of, and if you're interested in popular science, Richard Dawkins is not the least guy. And Richard Dawkins is taking an important stance on that. There is a very hot debate in biology between group selection and individual selection. I'm not taking place into that debate because in my vision of emergence, I'm still doing the selection at the individual basis. The replicator, the famous replicator of Richard Dawkins, they're still the birds, or they're still the robots. There is no group replicator. So the notion of group selection, and I'm completely agreeing with Richard Dawkins, the notion of group selection is according to, if I was alone to tell that, I would be ridiculous, but Richard Dawkins is telling it the same. The notion of group selection, according to him, is meaningless. He had a very hot debate with Edward Wilson, who just passed away, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago. Another very famous biologist simulating ants. It was a source of inspiration for us when we decided to simulate ants. For Wilson, group selection was existing in nature. And group selection, according to him, was explaining cooperation. Obviously, if you can select group, you can have a way to explain cooperation in nature, and Edward Wilson wanted to explain cooperation in nature because selection is pushing to selfish. And this is the whole paradoxical, conclusion of Richard Dawkins, we are selfish gene, but, there's something like emergent phenomena which even if we have selfish gene, we can still behave cooperatively. And for Wilson, the only way to explain that was group selection. Here, I'm explaining a little bit like Richard Dawkins that you can be cooperative, even being selfish, because you may have this strong emergent effect. So I'm very much in Richard Dawkins' type of vision of things. I'm against group selection. You can have group selection in nature. Obviously, it makes sense in the human nature, not real nature, but in best way for me, the best way to explain group selection when I have to explain it to students is football games. Obviously, if you have a cooperative team and you have a team where every player is playing in a very individual way, obviously the cooperative team has much chance to win the game than the individualistic team. And then you select the whole group, you know. The whole team is being selected. While in biology, you need to select the individual, you know. So you have this contrasting discussion about group selection. My position is that natural selection is still played a role at the individual level, but you need to integrate the group effect, and you need to integrate the environment, because if you don't have the environment, you don't need the group. You need the group of robots because you have a gap. You need the group of birds because you have the wind, because you have the predator. You see the point? And you need the group of molecules of the heart because the heart at the end pumps blood. Obviously, if you don't have this group of cells, you won't have any pumping blood. Okay, thanks for your attention, and I hope there will be discussion and questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hugo, for this really enthusiastic, pedagogical, philosophical talk. It was really interesting, and I'm sure you will have many, many questions. I will just come back to the beginning of your talk, and perhaps let me give you a really difficult, a really hard question. You claim, you defend that UML diagrams are able to describe the whole model, multi-agent model, with easier than in any language. So my question is, do you think it could be able in a time to prove some properties of a model, just having a look to the diagrams? For example, you have simple properties like convergence, fixed point, and you have also complex properties like emergent phenomenon, free scale, etc., etc. Do you think it could be possible, like tools that we have in other theories, like automata? In automata, you have some tools who are able to simplify some models. Do you think it could be possible with using these UML diagrams?
Oh, thanks, Philippe, for your question. And you're right. I think it's a pretty hard one. I know people, computer scientists more on the theoretical side, who are using some of the UML diagrams in order to prove the kind of thing you're interested to prove. For instance, not all the diagrams seems to have this potentiality inside. State transition diagrams, which are very close to Petri net or things like that, seems to have this property because when you deal with convergence, etc., for instance, you need to add numbers, so it's not easy to add numbers in all those diagrams. You know, for instance, the class diagrams. I know that some very theoretical computer scientists are using, and mainly, according to my knowledge, transition diagram to prove things like stability, convergence, etc. I'm sure they do. I don't know exactly how they do, but I'm sure they do. There are a lot of people, for instance, you know, also looking at, and again on the theoretical computer side, you know, when you have to deal with very sensitive code like, you know, programming an airplane or a nuclear power plant, they seems to be able but I should refer to their papers. But just playing with some of the UML diagrams, you know, guarantee that there is no, you know, unexpected event or something which is outside the limits or something like that. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. There exist people who do so, but I'm not.
Other questions?
Please.
Okay.
I think there was a young lady, and then I'll be happy to take yours. Ladies first.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. And I have a question about the emergency definition, because some model have seems to have a kind of emergence of emergence because there are some results that couldn't be understood by the humans, like deep learning, for instance, or yes, even for the random selection, for instance. That what is your idea about this? About this random, like this, some results that we can't understand. So it is considered as emergency or just as a lack of knowledge for people?
Thanks for your question. It's a very interesting question. I have some of my friends in France, again, like Philippe, or you might know him, I think Jean-Pierre Delahaye, and also, what's the name of him? Howard Swim, a guy working on complex systems in France, who are trying to give a definition of emergence related with unpredictability. For instance, in the game of life, it's hard to predict the glider. It's hard to, do an analytical compression that has a glider in outcome and the rules of a game in income. That the glider is just a natural consequence of the rules. In mathematics, sometimes we have a way to compress the reality by some integration, or and one of the definition of emergence that I disagree with, but I think it's, as I said, there's a debate about emergence, is you have an emergence thing if you need to run the simulation to understand what's happening. If you can't anticipate by a kind of mathematical compression, and this is a definition that you can accept. Well, it's receivable, it's not mine, and because it's not mine, because to some extent it's still fully reducible to the part. It's not because you cannot predict. For instance, we have that in chaos. You cannot predict what's going to happen in the long term, but chaos is fully determinist. So I don't like this definition of assimilating emergence to unpredictability or even difficulty to predict. You were mentioning deep learning. It's true that no one really understands exactly how the cat is being distinguished from the dog, for taking one very popular example of deep learning. But we know that the neurons is doing the job. So again, this wouldn't be my definition of emergence. And in case of biology, as I was telling, you need to enlarge your space of vision. You need to take into account other ingredients that makes it to some extent a little bit more exciting. But it's just a proposal, and it's not a final one, and there will still be discussion.
Thank you very much.
Please. I think there was a question.
Thank you, first of all, for your interesting talk.
Thanks.
I have two questions because of two parts of your talk. The first one is about object-oriented programming and agent-based programming. I want to know your opinion on what is an agent. And then the question is, as a speculation, if we're going to have any artificial general intelligence, will that be an object-oriented program or a multi-agent system? And then, as a group selection, don't you think that we are the result of a group selection after the dinosaurs?
So let's first, for the second one, which is to some extent easier, there is a very hot debate in the community, in the biologist community, with this group selection. It's a debate which really originated back to the 70s, and that is the reason why, in fact, Richard Dawkins wrote one of the most popular scientific book, which is The Selfish Gene, because there was this debate, and Richard Dawkins was really irritated by this notion of group selection. And so the whole book was to defeat that, and saying that because people were saying, look, as human beings, to some extent, we are cooperative, to some extent. There's a lot of competition also in between human beings. As you know, there's a natural, Darwinian explanation of human being which push we can make a very political discussion here on the rightists are more Darwinian and the leftists are more, to some extent, cooperative, whatever, but it's a political discussion. But the group selection, if I had to make a statistics among biologists, I would say that Richard Dawkins has won the game. Most of the biologists will be against group selection. They would accept my point of view that there is some group effect, but the selection, this whole idea of Richard Dawkins, that who is the replicator? The replicator is the individual. The gene is in us. There is no gene of a group. The gene is in the individual. This is the individual which replicates, not the group. So, I mean, group selection, if you still adhere to group selection, you'll be marginalized in the modern biological community. Now, with respect to your first question, this agent-based modeling versus object orientation, I don't know. Obviously an object, my agent in my economical modeling, I had a producer, seller, consumer, whatever. They were object. I had a class, agent with 4 subclasses, producer. No, it was even more subtle. The agent can be in different states, and each state was a subclass. It could be producer, seller, consumer, etc. So I put everything in an object-oriented form because this is what I know. I mean, obviously, I would have been taught agent-based modeling. I would have done things perhaps differently, And my whole things was to, I presented the things like I'm doing them, and I think I'm doing them right. I don't think I'm wrong in doing the things I'm doing. But obviously, there was this community of agent-based modeling who seems to do things differently. They have their own language. They have their own graphical ways to represent agent. I don't know how to map those. I have no idea. I sell UML, and there's, I think, an interesting works. Perhaps it has been done. This paper that I was showing to you was written 10 years ago. So perhaps in 10 years, Philippe or whatever could tell me there might be interesting works mapping those two communities. What I can tell is that why I'm using object-oriented, why I'm using UML is because I'm using object-oriented programming. I'm not using agent-based programming. I don't know agent-based programming. I'm teaching Java. No, I'm teaching Kotlin. And I think the programming language are object-oriented. The most popular one are object-oriented language. Or tell me if I'm wrong, I'm teaching many universities, and I've never taught agent-based modeling. I'm teaching object-oriented programming. So this is why I keep with UML, because UML is the natural way to map the graphical interpretation of what you're doing with object orientation. So this is what I'm doing, and I'm very modestly saying that, you are perhaps much more, inclined in, I know there's a lot of interesting things taking place in agent-based modeling, but I don't know them.
There is a question from the Zoom chat.
Excuse me. What is your opinion about the use of architecture similar to Hopfield networks applied to the field of in-memory computation? Oh, I like that, Mariano. I think we focus too much on deep learning and this feed-forward neural network. I think there is still, I don't know if you heard me. Excuse me, I didn't see it. Thank you for your spectacular talk. What is your opinion about the use of, yeah. There was I don't remember the name of the author, making content-based memory with Hopfield networks. I think it was even more than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a long, long time ago, using Hopfield networks for coding memory. I found a fascinating book. Didn't have any following up. I must admit that today in neural network, as you know, there's a kind of I used to call it the black hole of deep learning. Black hole in two senses. Everyone is doing deep learning. Black hole, attracted by it, but also black hole because no one understands what it is. And obviously the other fields of neural networks like the Hopfield networks, which is a different kind of well, there is some part of it like you may know, Geoff Hinton is still doing things like encoding, decoding. So he's also applying some form of memory-based computing, content-based memory. There is something like that in a part of the deep learning community with encoding, decoding, and you have the same output than the input, and you try to do things like that. And but I think it's another way, another very interesting investigation. You should, if you're interested in those things, you'll be back in fashion. Right now it's not more fashionable, but fashion is just a question of cycle.
Okay. I think we can conclude the talk. Okay. It's a time for the coffee break, and thanks again for your.
Thanks to you.
Okay, so welcome to this, I think, last session, one of the last parallel sessions of PAAMS. PAAMS are the collocated events. This session is of PAAMS, simulating complex systems. We have 6 papers, 3 in person and 3 online presentations. And we will start with Paul Brignot, who will present data synchronization in distributed simulation of multi-agent systems.
Hello everybody. Today I'm really glad to introduce you our work about data synchronization in the distributed simulations of multi-agent systems, led at the FemtoST Institute with Bénédicte Herman, Christophe Lang, and Laurent Philippe. So to start with, I will present you a very basic distribution algorithm that we found in literatures and what data synchronization limitation it introduces. Then I will present our distribution technique and the definition of several synchronization modes before comparing it in the results. So to start with, we are targeting generic time-step multi-agent system simulation with about 1 million agents at least. So as you know, it's quite hard to simulate such large-scale systems on a single computer due to time and memory limitations. So what we can do to raise those limits is to use high-performance computing resources, such as computing clusters. So what is a computing clusters? It's basically some individual computers that you link with some cables, and you have several computation nodes. Each one has a given number, of course, but the strong limitation is that each node can only communicate through explicit messages. There is no direct memory access between computation nodes, what makes it really hard to simulate a global system on such architectures. So I'm going to present you the basic algorithm used by repaste HPC or DMason, for example, to execute a distributed simulation of multi-agent systems. So let's take this very simple spatial multi-agent system, and let's assume that we want to execute it on 4 processes, for example. So the first thing that you can do is to simply split the environment in 4 parts. As you can see, there are more agents on the first process, but we don't care for now. And you assume that each process will execute the agents that are located in each environment part. But then you need agents on a process might need to communicate with agents on other processes, and this is a big problem. So what you can do is to add what we call some overlapping zones, when you are going to put some copies of agents near borders located on other processes. And once done, local agents in blue there can interact with this copy of distant agents. But even if you have an access to the copy, it's still very difficult to know how to interact with this copy and what interactions are exactly allowed with the copy. So, for example, in request HPC, each copy is only updated at the end of each time step. So you can't write data to other processes, and the data you are reading might be out of date. In Dell'Aquila, all agents, including local agents, are accessed through what we call a ghost copy, a copy of data from the previous time step. And in other platforms, such as Flame, agents are only allowed to communicate through messages, so there are no write access to. And we also see in literature some model-specific conflict resolver to allow distributed interactions. So all those techniques are not generic, as we saw with this distribution. What we can do if I have a model that is not a spatial model, what can I do if if my agents need to write some data to other agents, since those platforms do not allow it? And also we saw that the data synchronization issues our agents can interact is very linked to the way you distribute your multi-agent system, and I don't think it should be the case. And also there is just no analysis about the performance of the synchronization mode chosen, or about reproducibility and the impact on the model. Will it really give me good results if I can't perform write operation, or if I only access copies of agents, and so on. So first, we already proposed a generic way of distributing multi-agent systems in other contributions based on graphs, but the only thing you need to know now is that a local agent executed on a process can have access to other local agents and to what we call distant agents, represented in dashed there. And so access modalities for local and distant agents might vary, for example. But in any case, the agents have always an access to all its neighborhood. So then we introduced a kind of generic data synchronization interface. So we just defined some read and acquire operations. So between a read, or an agent can perform a read and read is read operation on another agent, and between those guards, it can potentially read any data on the agent, and if it performs an acquire, it can also write data to its neighbor agent. And we also introduce a generic synchronized method that will be called at the end of each time step. And the interesting thing there is that when you implement your multi-agent system simulation, you will only use those generic read and acquire methods. And then what they actually do will depend on the synchronization mode that is used under the hood. So then we can introduce some different synchronization mode. For example, I will introduce the ghost mode that actually corresponds to the request HPC behavior. What I call the global ghost mode corresponds to the dell'Aquila behavior. And then we introduced a brand new mode called hard sync mode that allows some concurrent read and write operation across processes, what is currently not allowed by existing platform. As examples, we also introduce other modes, such as push ghost mode or push global ghost mode, that are not implemented yet. So now I will present you how we can implement each method of the interface to implement different synchronization modes. So in order to implement the ghost mode, for example, read and acquire methods will have no effect, actually. You will just return the current state of the data on the current process. Release methods have no effect too, since there is no need for concurrency management in this case. And all the work will be performed by the synchronize method, called at the end of the time step, and it will just import the current state of distant agents from their origin processes. In order to implement the global ghost mode, the dell'Aquila equivalent mode, it's pretty much the same thing, but there, when you perform some read, you will also return a ghost copy, even if the agent is local to the process. And acquire methods will return the current agent state, but they are assumed to be applied only to the current agent, since you have no right to modify other agents, even local agents, in DMason. There is no concurrency management needed either, and the synchronize method will do the same thing as before, import the new state of distant agents, and also update the ghost copies of local agents. For the async mode that we introduced, it's much more complicated, since when you perform read and acquire operations, you will need to perform point-to-point MPI communications to fetch from origins processes up-to-date data each time. And in addition, you will need to manage concurrency using a readers-writers algorithm, since in this case, many processes might try to modify the same agent simultaneously. So that's why we need some specific behavior for the release methods too, and the synchronize method, called at the end of the time step, will just keep handling requests until all processes have finished. All of this has been integrated in a distributed simulation platform called FPMAS that solves other problems such as load balancing, the distributed runtimes, and so on. But what I presented there only focused on the data synchronization aspect, but you need to know that there are other problems to distribute the execution of multi-agent system simulations. So now, let's compare all those modes that I introduced. I will compare them using two kinds of criteria. Quantitative criteria, simply what are the performances of each mode on the same model, and qualitative criteria, such as what operations are allowed or not in the mode. We already saw that for ghost mode and global ghost mode, you can't perform write operation on distant agent or even on local agents, while with the hard synchronization mode, it's possible to perform write operation on distant agents. And also, a very important feature in distributed simulation is the reproducibility aspect. We'll see later why. So about performances, what you can see is that on the left, we performed some experiments with 1 million agents on a 1,500 square grid with classical SEER epidemiological models. And thanks to our interface, we can apply all the synchronization modes on the same model and see, without modifying the model, and see what happens in terms of performances. So on the left, you can see that the ghost mode is the fastest one, because you have almost nothing to do. You just need to update distant agents using collective communications at the end of each time step, what is very efficient. The global ghost mode is a little slower, since you also need to store copies of local agents. And finally, the hard synchronization mode is clearly the slowest, since you need within your time step to perform some distant communications between processes, which is very costly. And then in terms of reproducibility, I won't detail everything there, but when it comes to distributed execution, you actually have lots of reproducibility problems, such as because of parallelism, maybe between two executions, you won't have the same results because the speed of each process is undeterministic. And also, you might wonder what happens if an agent executed on a process during an execution and executed on another process in another execution will produce some different model results, for example. So we define some different reproducibility levels. Then what I can do is to compare with those three criteria the different synchronization mode I introduced. So what you can see there is that, for example, if you want to simulate a model and have the best performances possible, but you don't care about interactions, you don't need some write operations between your agents, and you don't care on reproducibility either, I would advise you to use the ghost mode that has the best performances, but it's quite poor in terms of interaction and reproducibility. On the other hand, if you really need something strongly reproducible, you want exactly the same results between all the executions, the only mode that you can use is the global ghost mode, but you will have some poor performances compared to the ghost mode. And finally, if you really need to perform concurrent read and write operations between your agents, you need to use the hard synchronization mode, but it will be very costly in terms of performances and reproducibility. So to conclude, I tried to show you that there is really a need for different synchronization modes in the context of distributed simulation of multi-agent systems, while existing platforms only provide a single and arbitrary synchronization mode currently. And according to me, while doing this, you can't pretend to simulate any multi-agent system, and you might also have different needs about performances and reproducibility and so on. And I also showed that many modes can be implemented using a single interface, what allows to apply different synchronization modes to many multi-agent systems. In practice, I also provided some modes analysis in order to help modelers to choose the right synchronization mode depending on their needs and models. And all those modes have also been implemented within our distributed simulation platform called FPMAS. In terms of perspectives and future works, we can wonder if it is possible to define and implement more synchronization modes with different compromises and different properties about reproducibility, performance, interaction, or maybe other criteria. And we also plan to integrate the synchronization algorithm within other existing platforms, such as Gamma, to allow those existing platforms to run on a computing cluster, actually. So thank you for listening, and I'm listening to your questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions?
On your performance graph showing how the method scaled with the number of cores, did I see correctly? Was there a superlinear speed up on the which one, on the hard sync mode, the blue one?
I don't think it's super linear. The linear is the purple one.
Well, at least, but you know, given a scaling factor that whatever is above the, I guess, the 65 cores had a bigger speed up than for the 32.
Oh, yes, about the blue curve.
Yes, yes.
You mean? I'm not sure why this happened exactly. It might be because the communication are more distributed with 64 cores than with 32 cores. So you have, at the scale of each process, you have less communications actually to perform with your neighbors. So it can explain such a phenomenon.
Yeah. Oh, it's very encouraging.
Any other question?
not so well defined and structured studies. I did like a random update of agent states, and I found that that in that way I kind of had the similar behavior of a pseudo-parallel behavior of the agent population. What do you think about that? A random updates of the agent population.
I'm not sure that I understand.
Well, I'm talking about a non-deterministic simulation, right? So basically, you have maybe 1,000 agents in an environment, and in order to have the evolution of the simulation, instead of going through all of them and update in sequence or synchronize it as one major clock, like it just updates randomly, and then it's kind of simulating life, artificial life things, because living beings they update themselves independently what happened to the others, right? So software processes, my opinion, but it's not given by data, maybe a good approximation of, even if you don't have such a large number of cores, for example, you have a less number of cores. So what's your opinion? It's not a question, actually. Is that correct to do a random updates of the agents, the internal state?
I don't think I understand. You have a model where the agents...
Every agent has an internal state machine. You can think about it.
Yes.
They can take sensors, local sensors readings, right? Or you can imagine like a grid, right? Although every agent has a local environment, and so has sensors around, and has to update itself in order to decide the next action, to interact also with other agents or with the environment. So while you're writing the simulator, okay, on my experience, on my humble experience, which I didn't do this very structured study, I found one way to do it synchronized. Well, I go for a for loop for every single agent, wait for the previous state of everybody, and update the state for the current state for everybody. Okay, that's like having a global clock, like in a digital electronic. Yes. You have one clock, every cell updates at the same time.
Yes.
Okay, then on the other hand, I also did a simulation where each agent updates randomly at a random time.
You mean, okay, so completely unsynchronized with others?
Without synchronization, no synchronization, just a random time update.
Okay, now I understand. So I saw that there are other works about it, like leaving each process to advance completely independently from others, and see if the multi-agent simulation stay consistent, actually, because it would mean that an agent have an access to some other agents that are in the past, actually, or agents in the past might access information from the future, what can be quite a problem. But personally, I only worked on the data synchronization aspect. And the time synchronization aspect is completely another problem. So in order to not only to simplify, but to only work on the data synchronization aspect, I worked on the assumption that the simulation is strictly time-stepped, and we call it a conservative synchronization, actually. So really each agent must wait for all others. But I guess that since data synchronization and time synchronization are two problems, guess that even if you have a more relaxed time synchronization, actually, you still might have those data synchronization issues. So maybe it's a question you can raise also even if in a relaxed time synchronization environment.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Or okay.
Just a hard question to finish.
Okay.
You are able to run 1 million agents. When do you need 1 million agents? I explain. If you want, for example, to modelize the COVID crisis in France, you need 60 million agents. So it's not sufficient to modelize precisely. So you have to make a reduction of the problem. And if you make the reduction to 1 million, it's quite the same than make the reduction to 1,000, for example. So when do you consider that we need a huge number of agents?
So there are actually two kinds of techniques to simulate large-scale systems. If you choose to simulate all agents, you have many agents. And I saw a lot of works of people who aggregate agents and describe them with kind of equations to reduce the number of agents to simulate. So with this second technique, it might be more complicated because you need a way to aggregate agents, and also it might add some imprecisions, maybe. I think the idea of distributed execution is that you perform no aggregation at all and you simulate as many agents as you need. So if you need to simulate 100 million or 1 billion agents, just you use 500 cores and you simulate them. And it can be useful in contexts such as urban simulations. If you want to simulate a whole city with every car and buses and even pedestrian, you will need millions and millions of agents. And I really think that in this case, it can be really useful to simulate each agent. And I also have examples. Some people propose to me some biological simulations where you might need to simulate every bacteria in 1 meter square.
Yes, but it's not exactly my question. My question is not can you do that, but is it useful? You know, because of course you can simulate all the bacteria in a cell, but is it really useful? As you can see, that biologists or mathematicians are able to obtain the same properties with a less number of agents.
In the case of urban simulation, I think it's really useful because I previously worked on a project where the purpose was to evaluate pollution emissions in the city of Lyon, for example. And in order to really evaluate the pollution emissions at the scale of each road, for example, you really need to simulate as much cars as you can, because traffic flow and traffic jams are really dependent on the movements of really each car. So in that case, I would find it really useful to simulate all the cars in the city.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you again for the presentation. Let's move to the next speaker, Lisa Gramoli. We will present the paper, Control Your Virtual Agent in its daily activities for long periods.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming here and to assist to this work. I'm glad to present my paper regarding the control of your virtual agent in its daily activity for long periods. So it's a work with the laboratory of Liesa and the Orange Company. So, what is your goal in this paper is a simulation of autonomous agent to perform daily activities in indoor environments. So you can see here on the video that an agent that can perform daily activity in a 3D smart house. So this is what we want to do in this paper. So for now, I'm going to talk about the use case and the challenges regarding the topic of my paper. First, the main use case is the generation of daily routines in indoor environments. So we want to use our agent model to enrich virtual environment by simulating human behaviors through virtual agents. The other use case is to help researchers and developers using simulation to generate new databases. So first, to improve existing simulators, allowing the generation of data for indoor inhabitant understanding. So we have some example here of existing simulator which could need to have, which are able to generate data by computer vision or by data from connected objects. And so an agent model simulating behavior could be useful for them. And there is also, by using our data, we can provide data for activity detection field that use algorithms like deep learning, for instance, that need very important data. So it can be useful for them. Sorry. So regarding the challenges, we must in order to generate accurate, diversified, and credible data, we want to reach some requirements. So we want to have a good ratio between control and autonomy of the agent in order to let the user imposing specific activity while letting the agent be autonomous during its free time. We also want to execute activity in a 3D environment. We want to be able to interrupt some activities that are allowed by the agent. And we want so the required activity given by the user must be performed with the expected time and duration. However, in the case of the literature, there is a few existing approaches addresses all these challenges at the same time. This is why we need to create a proper agent model. So in the proposed solution, we propose a BD-based architecture in order to have the belief, desire, and attention system. In this inner solution, we have an internet state model which simulates the human needs in order to manage the autonomous part of the agent. We have a scheduler we have the user's constraint module to constrain the behavior of the agent regarding the requirement of the user. And we have the scheduler, which is used to adapt autonomy according to the situation and the constraints given by the user. So then we have an execution process to perform activity in the virtual environment. Our model of implementation is a simulation of in a 3D house environment, which is created by Unity engine. So regarding the related work, we have several categories which can be used to create an autonomous agent. We have the reactive-based approaches, where we can see the BDE system, or the action selection mechanism, where they can create some motivation to choose the goal of the agent. So these kind of approaches are well suited to manage events happening in the environment, but they have some difficulty to respect strong constraints which can be given by a user, for instance. On the contrary, we have the planet-based approaches, where we can see some approach like HTN, strips, or meta-heuristic like genetic algorithm, for instance. So this kind of approaches can respect strong constraints given by the user, but sometimes they have some difficulties to manage events because the agent will anticipate all these future constraints. So when an unexpected event happens, it could be difficult to manage. Then we have the learning-based approaches, such as the model of LIDA, the rule-based system, or the reinforcement learning, where the agent will learn about its previous experiences or its memories. So they are well suited to manage the new events happening, but there are difficulties to respect strong constraints because of the nature of this approach, where we need to retrain when we modify some parameters. We also have some specific approaches that are interesting in your case. First, we have some hybrid approaches which can combine the previous approaches that we can saw. And for instance, we have the work of De Silva and al., where they combine HTN and BDI in order to mix the reactive-based approaches with plan-based approaches. But in their works, they are not focused on adapting autonomy. There are difficulties to manage time constraints because of HTN, and there is no 3D execution. We have also the reactive scheduling proposed by Asvin and al., where they propose an intelligence assistant to manage services that can be useful for a user, such as email management, phone management. So with reactive scheduling, it's well adapted to manage autonomy according to the situation. Unfortunately, in their works, it's a user-oriented approach. So for us, we need to have an agent-oriented approach. Their use cases are too distinct to be used as is created, and there is no 3D execution part. Another model is a SMASH model proposed by Amaro and Reno. So in this model, in input, we can put a calendar to the agent for its daily activities, and in output, we have another calendar that shows all the activities performed by the agent. And so the activities are chosen using probabilities based on real data, so it's an advantage with this. But for Dropbox, there is difficulty to respect strong constraints because the activities are chosen by probabilities, and there is no 3D execution. And at the last specific approach, we have the genetic algorithm that is used with time constraints. So this genetic algorithm is launched inside the time windows that can be given by the user. And so they can respect strong constraints, and they can manage events. But in their case, there is no 3D execution, and there is no relationship between the activities that are performed outside these time windows. So in your case, we need to have some impact with the previous activity. So in conclusion of this state of the art, we have a state of the art that does not really focus on adapting this level of autonomy according to the situation and the user constraints. Sometimes there is no real-time 3D execution that is proposed, and there is a few approaches focusing on long-term simulation where some issues can happen, such as the over-representation and the sub-representation of an activity, for instance, or the accumulation of time drift, which can happen between the simulation and the theory. Because of this accumulation, we can have some really huge gap during long-term simulation. So this is why we want to propose our own agent model. So as I said, this model is inspired by BDE architecture, so we can see some parts here. Here in purple, we have the external perception, which can be related to belief. We have in blue the internal states, which can be related to desire, where we have a need model which simulates human needs. And we have the decision part in yellow, which represents the intention of the agent. And inside we have the activity scheduler, which can manage can adjust the autonomy of the agent. So our model is used to adapt the decision-making autonomy according to the situation by using the three processes here. We have the internal state to give information for the autonomy part. We have the user's constraints in red here, which where they can be provided by an agenda of activity, for instance, or some input parameter, which are given to give info about the control of the agent behavior. And we have the decision-making process, which is used to adjust the autonomy. Sorry. So first, I'm going to talk about more precisely of the need model, which is inside the internal state model of the agent. So it will simulate the human needs, so such as the thirst, the hungry, and the needs are ordered according to the Maslow's pyramid of needs that we can see on the right. So the more urgent needs are on the bottom of the pyramid, whereas the more elaborated need and the less urgent are given on the top. And in your case, the needs are selected for the level of urgency based on the intensity level of the need according to the time, the pyramid, the level in the pyramid of the Maslow, and we have also the threshold urgency level, which is a predefined value to know where the need is considered as urgent for the agent. Yeah. So then I'm going to talk about more precisely of the activity scheduler. So the goal of this is to adjust the autonomy level according to the situation. It will give an input the nearby activity, so it's activity given by the calendar of the user. And it will retrieve also the duration of the plan, so it corresponds to the free time the agent can have. It will also retrieve the time constraints of the activity to know if an activity can be selected during the duration of the plan. We also retrieve the current state of the needs regarding the urgency, and we also retrieve the perception data to know some constraints about the environment. And in output, we will give a plan containing ordered activity with their duration that will be then selected just one after one to be executed in the 3D environment. So here I will give an example of the activity scheduler process. So for instance, we can have working given by the user and watching TV given by the user in the calendar, and we have a free time between them, between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. And so the scheduler will retrieve the time budget, so it's the planned duration. It is a free time it's a free time of the agent. And then he will anticipate the future urgent needs. So he will, by using some function given in the internal state, he will try to anticipate the future urgency of each need. So like first toilet, hygiene, and sport in the example. And then he will try to select for each of them the activity satisfying the need. So for instance, for search, he will select drinking. So at this step of the process, we can see that it could be some overlapping between the activities. There is some echoes, sorry. Some overlapping between the activities, and this is why we need to switch first, to shift the start time or the duration of each activity in order to be able to let them inside of the plan and to, at the same time, to respect the minimum duration of each activity that are given by the user. Then, after the activity placement, we can adapt the duration of the activity in order to extend them if they can. So we can extend them until the next activity or until the maximum of duration, if their maximum duration is below is below the size of the gap between the two consecutive activities. And then if it's still a gap at this step, if it's still a gap between the activity, we can fill the gap with other activities that are used to keep the agent busy, so such as reading, watching TV, or some entertainment activity. And with this, we have a complete plan of the agent. So in terms of the results, here is a global architecture of the implementation. So we have implemented to produce some results. So we have the part of the constraints that are given by the user. We have the agent behavior model, and then each activity are given by the model to be executed by a script writing module called 7. So it's a Petri net-based architecture in order to execute animation and action directly in the virtual environment. So here we have the Unity part where we have the animated character which will execute the activity, and the 3D reactive environment which contains the semantic of the world as well as the 3D virtual house. So we created 20 activities, but more can be added if you want. And we have simulated 8 days for the result. So here we have an example of this Petri net. So here we can have a token which can move to place to another place, and when he moves, they trigger a transition. So it triggers the action, it triggers the movement of the agent, and we have in the S we have the sensor to be sure that all the conditions are respected to change an action to another action. And the E is the effector part, so is the action in itself. Here we have the results about the need satisfaction. So we want to know if each needs are well satisfied in the time of their urgency. So globally, this table shows this because we have compared the initial parameters that are given in the first column here and in the third column here to the result of the simulation, that we have the mean and the standard deviation here for each need that we have configured. So globally, we can say that all needs are satisfied in expected time because their average satisfaction are at the time of the need urgency. Here we also have some visual feedback about the agent. So there is two kind of results. So the first result is made with a strict agenda where the user don't give any free time for the agent. So here we have the theoretic calendar that show what the user has put in input. And below we can see the simulated calendar used by the agent. And we can see that all the activities are performed in the proper time and duration. And if the user allows it, it can also allow some interruption for the needs that are really urgent and that need to be satisfied because the activity of the user cannot satisfy them. So we can see with the blue and yellow triangle some interruption that happens, and of course this is activity that can be interrupted and it is allowed by the user. So below we have the moderate agenda where the agent has some free time, so it's in the cold gray here, and we can see that the agent can fill all the free time to keep it busy or to satisfy his needs. And at the same time, we have the activity given by the user, which are made in the correct duration and start time. So to conclude with these results, we have validated our approach using statistics. So we have 99% of compliance with the strong constraints given by the user, And we have compared here, we have an example of this kind of agenda, where in blue we have the agenda given by the user, and in orange we have the agenda performed by the agent. So here we have the interruption, for instance, and and we have also, we can also see that all the activity given by the user are well performed. This model is able to simulate a long period continuously, and we have seen that all the needs are well satisfied in expected time. We are also able to interrupt agenda of activity if the user allows it, and when a need is urgent, and we have the activities that can be executed in the virtual environment while respecting the allocated duration given by the scheduler. So we have some demonstration here of a one-day simulation that where with this calendar given by the user, we have a panel showing the urgency of each need at the current time, and here we have the activity performed by the agent. So we have accelerated the time in order to see all the activity more quickly, and we can see that all the activity are well performed during the time, while the agent can perform each action of the activities. So in conclusion, in future works, we have proposed a configurable and ready-to-use model in order to populate virtual environments, in order also to generate simulated data, and to help the researcher to perform, to retrieve new data to help for the simulation. And we have proposed a model which can adjust the decision-making autonomy of the agent according to the user will. So for future works, we would like to evaluate our model for activity detection using virtual sensor in the smart house in order to generate other kind of data. We would like to compare our simulated data with real data to prove the credibility of data. And we want to enrich perception system and internet state model in order to add some other cognitive approach, such as the resource management, the preference, or the emotion, for instance. We would like to include a concrete scenario showing the management of dynamic environment, because our scheduler can be launched at any time that we want, but we don't have a concrete scenario for now. And we would like to extend our model to multi-agent system in order to allow the exchanges between several agents in order to have collaborative activities or information exchanges. So thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, feel free. Thank you.
Thank you. So time for questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting, and I understand perfectly how an agent works, but perhaps I missed something. But what happens when you have several agents, and how do they negotiate or collaborate, or how does it work when you have several agents who are discussing about something? And I'm not sure. At the time, I thought that I missed something, but I see in your future works that you talk about multi-agent system. So what does it mean exactly?
Yes, it means that for now, we simulate only one agent in the virtual environment. So we would like to first create a credible model of behavior for the only one agent to prove individually that they are able to simulate activity in a credible manner, but after we would like to add some other process to manage the multi-agent system.
Okay, so for example, in the scheduling problem, you do not have any negotiation between the agent about the schedule. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, for now in this case, but it is on future work, so for now it's like this.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the probability of unexpected events occurrence, in the sense that typically if you have a strict schedule, it becomes more and more difficult to comply to it. The more unexpected events occurs during the day. And I don't know if it makes sense to you, having the possibility to tune the occurrence of these unexpected events, or if this is somehow included in the fact that some activities might take longer because something is not, does not proceed in the way that you plan.
Yes. In this case, when there is a strict agenda, we would like to prove that our agent can respect the strict agenda given by the user. And it's true that humans cannot really manage the time like a robot, in fact. But we want to make sure that our agent is able to respect strong constraints, and then in the future we could add some drift to make more credible that oh yes, the agent is a little late with this activity. We need to change the duration, for instance. But regarding the unexpected part and the interruption, in fact, the user can choose if he wants to have interruption or not in the simulation. So in your case, in fact, we have a data where real humans must follow during 4 weeks, and sometimes there's some needs that are not taken into account in the calendar. It's going to toilet. So going to toilet was an unexpected activity. And this is why we want to integrate this kind of interruption even when we have a strong constraints, in fact.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Just a quick question. Yeah.
First one, how this work is related to Nicolas Saboré's recent works, because he works quite intensively on daily activity in home. And second one is to reformulate, will you use PetriNet to modelize joint activity between agents?
For the first one, I don't know the work of this Samolek, yes. Okay, thank you. So I couldn't say, but yes, if I saw some work on the IoT and the simulation of daily activities, in fact, and that yes, we try to, for instance, match the SMATCH model were used for IoT and so on to simulate daily activities in this. But I would like to show its work, in fact, thank you. And for the other question, yes, in the kind of execution, we use PetriNet because we have the module that allows it. But the model, the global model, is we try to be independent of the form of execution. So we could use a finite state machine if we want, or other kind of task execution or strips, for example. But for now, we have PetriNet-based models that can be provided by the ERISA, so we use it. And for joint activity, I think we could use PetriNet for this by just putting sensor at the beginning of the scenario, and we have sensor to know if we have the accurate account of agent to begin the activity. So we will see if it is possible.
Okay, thank you again for your answers.
Thank you.
next speakers, Karsten Robert, will present the work agent-based modeling and simulation of decision-making in flying ad hoc networks.
Okay, hello, welcome. I hope technically it's working. So I'm a bit exotic. I'm not a scientific academic researcher. I'm from a company called Airbus. You probably know that. But Airbus also has a central research and technology domain, and that's where I'm working. So I'm presenting you rather a application case of agent-based or multi-agent-based modeling and simulation for the simulation of decision-making in flying ad hoc networks. So I'll introduce that case quickly. So Airbus, you probably know, we create things that fly in the air, sometimes in space, but also some communication technology products, so for secure communication, and that's a bit linked to what we're doing. So I'm located here in that central research and technology domain, so I'm quite far away from the products, and I'm rather close to you. So we try to interface here to develop like the brilliant things of the future, and to quite looking ahead. So the challenge that we have here, so our colleagues, I'm a systems engineer, to be honest. I'm not a software engineer, I'm not a developer. So I'm looking at systems and complex systems. And that's what our colleagues from the communication domain came up with, to say let's use our free space optic communication tools, attach them to our flying products, and create a flying network, a high bandwidth network with free optical communication, so basically laser links. So at a similar speed as you have in a fiber cable in the Earth. So when looking at that as a systems engineer, I'm seeing a system of systems and a highly dynamic system of systems, and that leads me to agent-based representation of those constituent systems. So the challenge is to build that kind of flying network, the flying carpet, to provide high bandwidth to all of those partners that are linked there. But as the final goal, basically to have a fiber network in the sky to basically bypass or add additional connections that are not in the terrestrial network, or maybe not enough, not sufficient. And in total, we have a global goal to achieve. Normally they are expressed in service level agreements, and they can be competing. So that gives an additional challenge to all the decision making in the network. So how to basically derive or develop that, or we developed the constraints for our decision algorithm. We called it ConOps agent, or the concept of operations agent, that does some decisions. So there were at the beginning some planning options. The trivial solution of our colleagues say, okay, we have flight plans, we know where the aircrafts are going to fly. Let's pre-calculate it a day in advance, but everyone who has taken a plane knows that this is not really happening. Because in reality, we might be first at that place. The next step, there is only a probability where the plane will be. It's not going to be disappearing completely, hopefully, but we can't really predict in advance the exact position, and we need an exact position for pointing the lasers. So at the end of the day, it was clear to us we need to have, instead of pre-planning, we have to have ad hoc decisions in real time. So while we are running the system, so basically having that at each time in each step in the time. So the next question: where do we do that? Those decisions. Also, like the first idea is to have a big central computer, and basically ask the airplane, what the airplane asks the server where to connect, where are the others, so that you can see that there's a lot of this communication needed, and we have a real bottleneck here. If this one falls out, we have a real problem. So basically, we are going to just rely on local data, and coming to that point where only if we are in reach of each other, we have to communicate. So that's very reduced communication, and we expect a higher resilience from that and a higher reliability. So we want to have distributed decision making. So that leads to that agent representation of those constituent systems based on local and incomplete data. So basically we want to reduce the data as much as possible to be as independent as possible from the whole network. And as that whole thing is highly dynamic, so constituents or agents arrive and disappear, so they start and they land. Maybe sometimes they have other problems. And we have to consider like other obstacles like clouds in between. So we came up with a first like kind of a default algorithm how to decide or how each of those agents should decide what to do. So first it's basically observing its environment and gathering information of their neighbors, collecting that information and calculating some metrics about that information. So position, heading, speed of those. And then rank them in a way to say, okay, this is my first candidate, second candidate, and so on. And then starting a negotiation. So there was a question before. So here we have really a negotiation between those agents. So he's asking the first candidate, say, do you want to connect with me? So to say, we have limited resources, so we can't connect to all of our neighbors, so we have to have a selection. So in our use case here, we assume that we have 3 laser terminals, so we have a maximum of 3 neighbors we can connect, but not in all directions. And the other partner has the same problem. So we have to find a partner that is giving us the opportunity to create a stable network, which is like something that we can't see in global, so we have to have indicators of that, and to connect them. And the other guy maybe has another idea because there's another neighbor that is more promising to him. So they have a negotiation and then start, do we want to? Do I have a free terminal? Will we achieve that? If not, then try the next one. And like just from those metrics, the first idea that we could have is like just choose the nearest neighbor, say that's the shortest link. But if you imagine like airplanes flying across against each other, the time that they are in reach, and reach is about like 300 kilometers, up to 300 kilometers for such a laser link, that can be really quick that they are out of range. If they're like more or less in the same direction, that can take from minutes or even hours that they might be in range. So just the distance is not good enough, so we started to calculate some other metrics like the potential time they will be in reach and such things. But basically, the challenge is here. So the basic algorithm is not so complicated, but the challenge, the secret sauce is here: how to calculate those metrics, those performance indicators, and take the decisions, which are the basis for the decisions at the end. So we have several ideas how to do that. And then basically what is happening, we're only giving those agents the decision logic, and then they create a network, a magical network somehow. And we want to understand and measure that, and just not in one moment, but over a certain time. So we need to see that, and there's what we call then in the systems domain, emergent behavior happening. So basically what this whole system is doing. What is happening there based on those local decisions, and we want to see if we are good or not. Basically, we are doing like kind of human reinforcement learning. So we try and error and see what's happening, tweaking some knobs, improving that, and that leads me to the lookout at the end. But for achieving that, we created that, or we used a platform or a framework, Repass, to create a simulation of those agents. And what was nice, like from Repass, that it already comes with a nice GIS representation, which gives us a good like visual impression of what is happening there. And it's pretty flexible, and it's in Java. So we have a few guys that know programming Java. And we knew that we need to extend it to certain things, so not just the decision algorithms needs to be represented there, but for example, we ingest air traffic data. We have basically our simulation is based on 1 day pre-COVID that we assume as being a representative day, 24 hours. We even integrate like 3D cloud data, which is also like a special data format. We have to manage that. Which creates obstacles for it, and then see what is happening out of that. So first assessment, does that work? the statistics here is basically over the day. You see in the morning the connectivity is not really good because there are just a few airplanes in the air, and like random policy is basically the same thing, because like if we only have 2 neighbors and I choose those 2 neighbors randomly out of 2, I have the same situation. But then, like in the morning, 5:30, 6-ish, we have a massive improvement in our decision logic for the connectivity. So basically, how many aircraft have a connection, a route to a ground station? That's what we define here as the connectivity or ground connectivity. And then in the evening, it gets worse. The next thing is to understand, like, also the technical consequences of it. So first, like, that is the laboratory connectivity. If we introduce clouds and like real cloud data, we have a less connectivity, but still in a range that is acceptable. But also for our engineering guys to say, okay, is that link distance really necessary of like 300 kilometers? And we see we have quite a bit of them. For the base stations, they are really kind of small angles. The distance is not that large. But also where, for example, attach those laser terminals on the airplane, we did analysis where basically are those lasers pointed, and you see like most of them are kind of, for the base stations are backwards, and what are the elevations of those links. So that gives us input for some physical terminal design. And the total simulation, and to give you an impression, is like 24 hours in this case. We have more than 9,000 flights over Europe on that day. We integrated 51 base stations, those pink dots. And at the maximum time, there's more than 800 aircraft in the air at the same time. So basically, we're talking about 800 agents at one time, and basically they appear and disappear. And here you can see how that network evolves. And you can also see some effects that there are kind of islands created with like just one link that connects all of them. And if that link goes away, the whole group is disconnected. And that's things that we visually see here. And that gives us some indications how to improve that algorithm, what we then do in our kind of human reinforcement loop. To say, okay, and that's pretty slow, but takes maybe half a day to change the policy. But then we see the next results visually, but also in the figures, how that average connectivity, for example, is happening. So I hope I'm exactly at time. I was trying to speed up a bit, and thank you for your attention. And I'm free to ask questions. I was skipping a bit the outlook because that's current internal research work, but verbally I can tell by that.
Thank you for the presentation. Any questions? I have a question. I don't know the domain. But I wonder if you consider the computational resources that every aircraft has is similar for all the craft. I mean, if regarding the communication capacity and so on, are all of them considered to have the same resources, or is that important that some aircraft communicate slower than the others, and you have to take that into account? For example, if you are 10 seconds or I don't know or half a minute to communicate and decide which aircraft to communicate, is that important or not?
That plays a role, and that basically leads to really just rely on local data. So there is the basic information is being broadcasted, so we don't need to have a real like communication lane. So there is an ADS-B system that basically broadcasts every second the position of each aircraft, and that has a range of around about 300 kilometers. So we can just like listen and hear where the others are. But then the communication for the negotiation, for example, is really small band, and that's one critical point, that this needs to be there. But the timing is not so relevant, and the computation power on each of those like physical agents, so the flying aircraft, is also not critical. It's rather for the simulation, as we don't want to wait 24 hours for one day. there the performance is more critical for the implementation later. So we've done some implementation of a real piece of hardware, and this is just like kind of ridiculous from power that is there to calculate that simple kind of simplish algorithm. So that's not the problem, but that resilience. So basically, what happens if that connection is missing? That's one of the points that we want to address, and that's not fully addressed up to now in the simulation. So to be that reactive, but we'll be pushing that by basically only relying on local information and not like knowing the whole thing, which was one of the first decisions that we've taken, that this will not work. And just by the way, there's other activities. For example, Google did do something similar with balloons flying around, a project called Loom, and they were doing the central one and basically permanently communicating them. They were hitting scalability problems at the end of the day, and then stopped the project, not just because of that, but that's also a proof that decentralized is the way to go. And from our company, I mean, we have several use cases for that. Not just like the civil aircrafts, we have also other aircraft and other systems where that resilience is very, very important, and there might be even active means to reduce the communication capabilities in some areas. So we are really working on that to be as independent from those communication lines. But bandwidth is not a problem. So the laser links is also like really high bandwidth. That's gigabit, terabit bandwidth for the communication between the agents. We just need a few kilobits.
So we have time for another question, if there is any question. Or I don't know if in the online people who are online have any questions.
Basically, what we are currently doing, just to give that outlook, is, and that's why I was listening very interested to several talks here, is to basically switch from the human reinforcement learning to a machine reinforcement learning, AI, which turns out to be not that easy for that type of use case. We have communicating agents, we have very dynamics, and a lot of a huge observation space. The action space is also like varying. The observation space is varying. So it gives quite a challenges. So I'm hoping maybe for the next conference to give an update on that.
Okay, hope to see you there. Okay, thank you again for your presentation and answers. And now we move to, okay, thank you. We have now 3 online presentations. By the way, I need to check if the last speaker is connected or not. Is there also the speaker for the last paper?
I believe that would be me.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the next paper, Vianney Sicard. Okay, so he will talk about a declarative modeling language for the design of complex structures, agent-based epidemiological models.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So, just before talking about my objects, the DSL, I will start briefly introducing the context of this work. There's epidemiological modeling. Epidemiological modeling aims to anticipate and evaluate the effectiveness of control measures in order to control and even eradicate a disease. And in our case, we will focus on veterinary epidemiology. And to be meaningful and to ensure a strong support to decision makers, models must be realistic, especially with regard to the situation on the ground. That is, they must be able to represent a verified brain system, including the spatial-temporal structure, which is a key element in the understanding the mechanism of transition routes of the anticipating the spread of pathogens. In most cases, this representation and its implementation in models is very complex, mainly due to programming, Moreover, these models are very difficult to maintain, adapt or revise. Therefore, the challenge is to propose a representation of a highly structured system, especially regarding the structuring of the population using a domain-specific language. And this DSL must take into account the structure in space and time, coupled to multi-level aspects of such systems. The solution is based on agent-based systems, which have proven their added value by their ability to account for the behavior, interaction, and tracking of individuals. And more specifically, multi-level agent-based systems are particularly suitable because they can represent evolutions at different scales. And finally, we base our work on the specific framework for epidemiological modeling, emulsion. It is based on a separation between the genetic simulation engine, with which interactions are done through its own declarative DSL. Also, it's true that several DSL already exist to tackle our issues, for instance, GAML, ACRR, or NetLogo, to name a few, which are agent-oriented programming languages, but they do not completely correspond to our situation and our goal, because they are programming languages, they are dedicated to developers or at least to scientists with programming skills, and this represents a real hurdle for modelers in developing models. Therefore, there is a need for a declarative language specifically dedicated to epidemiological modeling with all aspects I mentioned earlier. To address this challenge of representing the structure of the system, that is the organization in both space and time with multi-level accounting, I developed a specific design pattern for multi-level agent-based system and organizational design pattern. This pattern provides an explicit representation of the structural relationship between agents and accounts for the constant agent behavior and interaction between agents. In addition, it is able to take into account the environments, especially with regard to controlling their functionality and structures. To introduce the design pattern and the associated DSL, I will use an application case that illustrates well the different issues the pattern addresses, which corresponds to our application case that I will present later. It is about the organization, the management of pig farming system with the batch rearing management. We have two parts, one representing what we can call the social organization, the logical aspects, and the other representing the spatial organization, the physical aspect. For the social part, an individual is part of a litter. The litter evolves through different physical steps, insemination, gestating, flowering, etc. And the grouping of several litters evolving at the same time constitutes a batch. And the temporal evolution of the different states of sows and piglets constitutes a kind of biopic of the different batches. We have several batches separated in their physical progression by an interval. And for the spatial part, batches, litters, and so individuals should be housed in the farm. This housing depends on the physical step to be allocated in different sectors. Sectors are composed of room, and according to several rules, such as one batch per room at a time, etc. For this reason, we have a strong interaction between social and spatial organization, and this represents the overall management in our system. Now, some of the context is set. I will talk about the architecture of the pattern, which corresponds to the meta model of the DSL. So this is the multi-level agent-based pattern. It systematically describes the relationship between three levels, the organization levels, which is composed of groups of which atoms are members. And here everything is an agent, and agents evolve in an environment. So when I talk about environment, it is obviously in the multi-agent sense, that is to say an entity where agents are located and evolve. And this can be a physical or social environment, and this is important in this pattern. The atom is located in a anatomic environment with it encapsulated by a group agent, and the group agent evolves in a structured environment encapsulated by the organizational agent. As I said, the pattern is systematically describes the relation between three levels, and to be more explicit about its use, we can apply it to social aspects of the batch management. The atomic level represents the individual, the group, the litter, and the organization, the batch. In the same way for the spatial aspect, the individual is always the atom, the group is a sector, for example, and the organization is a farm. And both systems can coexist. That's why the atom refers to the same individual. A specific aspect of the pattern is its ability to be used recursively. The group can itself be an organization composed of a group corresponding to rooms, for example, and the atoms are always individuals and so on. It is thus possible to represent different scales. The different organizational levels are generated automatically through the genetic approach of the pattern. It is therefore very easy to add or to remove levels without compromising all the system. As I've said, the pattern is included into the emulsion framework and extends the DSL of emulsion. For instance, in emulsion, typical flow diagrams of epidemiological dynamics are represented by state machines. For example, here the flow between the different susceptible, infectious, and recovered are represented by respective rates beta and gamma, and the population dynamics by mortality rate mu and the population turnover both or other with the rate nu. In emulsion, these flows are represented by state machines. Corresponding to this state machine, here is an illustration of the declaration of this state machine with emulsion DSL. You can see it is based on the YAML syntax. It is notably readable and understandable. There is a declaration of the states, transition, and production for population renewal. In the same way, this is an illustration of the statement of the structure of the batch streaming system I presented earlier. The farm is divided into sectors, and sectors are themselves organizations, reference, that are divided into rooms. And if you look at the location in the rooms, piglets are obviously located in the same room of their mothers, and sows are distributed in the different rooms with one batch per room at a time. Another thing is the taking into account the dynamic of spaces. An environment can store information, such as a quantity of pathogen is in an expression. The diffusion of this information to other environments and other levels is represented by a weighted diacritic graph. Here, the information from excretion that can be propagated to other scales and levels, and the graph represents the structure of the contact between the different spaces. In order to establish a proof of concept of our approach, we applied the system to model the spread of influenza A virus. This is an interesting case today because there are few models that take into account an explicit representation of the population structure. It may be therefore interesting to use an existing model, implement it in the model, and then extend the model with specific structure and explore some assumptions through different scenarios. The idea is to establish a proof of concepts both in terms of design and functionality. And so the system is structured as in this figure. I would go back on the structure induced by the batch streaming management. Here you have two systems. The first is a basic model with a farrow to win system, that is piglet leaves the system of farrowing to be fattened up on another farm. And the different sectors are divided into rooms with one batch per room at a time, and the arrow represents the movement of individuals according to their physical states. The second is a farrow to finish system, with piglets leaving the system after finishing to go to the slaughterhouse. And this one is an extension of the basic model. The allocation in the different sectors depends on the physical steps. The duration in the different states may depend on the batch number. And the allocation is declared as in this example at above left. And in this case, you have a state machine that manages the physical changes, and these changes is passed on to the organization in charge of the allocation. As I say, we have applied our system to model the spread of influenza A virus. So just a few words on the epidemiological process. You have a typical MSER model with piglet with maternal immunity, susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. In this model, we consider an airborne transmission between sectors. We extended the original model based on a faro to win system to a faro fish system, adding the corresponding physical states, sectors, and so on. And we establish different scenarios corresponding to the representation of the isolation control measures between sectors. This consists of a factor applied to the force of infection, and this factor is modulated by a log scale.
4 minutes.
So, yes. This has a result. On the left, you have a faro to win system corresponding to the system, the basis model, and the right, the extended model, that is a faro fish system. This system makes it possible to have an explicit, readable, and then understandable representation in the implementation of the model. We can observe the impact of the structural changes, and in this case, we can conclude that farrowing sectors have played a major role in the spread of the pathogen, and that the control measures may be very effective. That is confirmed by the literature and field observation. And to conclude, I have demonstrated that the use of emulsion extended with organizational aspects combined with a specific language makes it possible to represent the population structuring both in space and time, coupling with different dynamic processes involved in the model. This facilitates reading, maintenance, and revision. Coupling with the different dynamic processes involved in the model, this facilitates reading and maintenance, and the application of the modeling of the spread of influenza A virus has highlighted the importance of population and spatial structuring, and the level at which control measures become effective. And at the end, therefore, we are able to propose an efficient solution to represent high structuring of the population for empirical modeling using a domain-specific language. And this solution based on multi-level agent-based system makes it possible to specify such a system without the associated complexity. And thank you very much to me.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions? We have a question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It is really interesting, and you introduce a new design pattern. And in my opinion, the community have a lack of design patterns. We need more design patterns. So congratulations for that. And I have I have many questions, but one which I'm so sure it's quite classical for you. But what is the difference between your model and what we can see in AGR from Madkit's model of Jacques Ferber?
Yes, and AGRE model too, with considering the environment. Yes, in fact, it's a good question. We have some differences, and one is we have no separation between social and physical aspects. And that's a first difference, and the pattern can be used recursively, and that's not really possible with the pipe.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. So, okay, maybe you can ask them more questions. Yeah.
Always Philippe Mathieu. I'm alone in this room, you know.
I'm alone too in my room.
It seems to be. So at the beginning of your talk, you yes. said that, or you claim that your model is quite different of the languages because it facilitates maintenance and in fact facilitates revision of the description of the model. And do you think, because to do that, you have to introduce a new description language, a quite of description language, which is quite declarative. So do you consider that you reached the initial aim? Is it easier now for semanticians to describe a model? It's not so, it doesn't seem so easy, in fact.
Yes. That's true. In fact, it's a good question, and that's open to most perspectives about the DSL. It's easier than programming a model from scratch, of course, because it's not from a CPP or a Python language, and it's a real difference. But it's not so difficult to read the YAML. We can understand it, but it's not so easy to write the YAML.
Yes.
That's a very big point. And so perspective is to enhance the DSL and include it with a real, a specific language with MPS. And but this is another works, but it's a perspective.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the presentation then. And,
thank you.
So let's move to next speaker. Next speaker, if I'm not wrong, is Erik van Heringen.
Yes.
Okay.
See if I can share the screen.
Yes. He will present an agent-based model of emotion contagion and group identification, a case study in the field of football supporters.
Okay, thank you. I hope the screen is visible. Let me know if it's not. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to give you an overview of our paper that explores how the spread of emotions in crowds are affected by group identification. And for this, we extended an existing agent-based model of emotion contagion. So emotion contagion is a well-established phenomenon in groups where people automatically tend to absorb some of the emotions of others. This drives the emotions of the group members to become more similar over time, and this can result in so-called collective emotions. And in very extreme cases, these can have tragic societal consequences. So, for example, in stampedes or in riots. A number of agent-based models of emotion contagion have considered how social relationships affect the spread of emotions. These models often look at either the influence of relationships between sets of agents, so based, for example, on intimacy or trust, or relationships that are based on the social role of the agent, like leader-follower, parent-child, or police and protester. However, neither explains why emotions of people that are part of a large abstract subgroup tend to align, even though these people do not know each other personally. For this, we proposed to model group identification as on a continuous scale, where emotion contagion is stronger among people that identify more with the same group. So our implementation of group identification is based on two theories. The first is social identity theory. This describes the tendency of people to self-categorize into groups, where the group becomes part of the psychological self. And what this means is that events related to the group are experienced to some degree as relevant to the person itself. So an insult to the group might be felt as an insult to the person itself. Further, people are known to favor their in-group members over others that do not belong to the group, and also develop hostility towards rival group members. Now, to determine the degree to which an agent identifies with a group, we draw from the belongingness hypothesis. And this hypothesis states that people have an innate desire to belong to a social group, and the strength of this desire was found to be correlated with the degree of identification. Now, since we focus on supporter aggression in the study, the desire to belong represents the degree of fanaticism of the supporters. Specifically, we focus in the study on one type of supporter aggression called pitch invasions, where people enter the playing field while this is explicitly forbidden. We chose this as it's relatively easy to detect these events. They can have tragic consequences, and they are also very difficult to control. Another reason why we chose to study supporter aggression is because group identification in football is widely accepted and even fostered. And fans also often show their group identity visibly. So we started from an existing model of emotion contagion called decades, where emotions in the form of feelings and arousal flow between agents via an emotion channel. So So here's the model in a little bit more detail. On the left is the receiver, and on the right side are the senders. And in between are the emotion channels. And how well emotion can flow from the sender to the receiver depends on the personality of both the agents and the distance between the agents. The sender also competes, the senders also compete for the attention of the receiver. What is important to note here is that each agent is always a sender and a receiver at the same time. Now, to account for group identification, we added the desire to belong to the agents, specifically to the receiver. And this property influences the appraisal of experienced events. So, for example, an agent experiences a goal that is scored by the team as more positive when they have a strong desire to belong. And the desire to belong also influences how well emotion flows from the sender to the receiver. So to match this description and literature, the emotional connection between the agents is stronger if they identify with the same group and if the desire to belong of the receiver is high. Now the opposite is true when the agents are part of rival teams and there's an intermediate connection with neutral supporters that does not depend on the desire to belong. Because we could not find an existing model for supporter aggression in stadiums, we made a simple behavior model based on observations from some videos of pitch invasions. And the agent picks one of 5 behaviors each time step based on a series of probabilistic choices. The agent can sit calmly or anxiously in its seat. It can leave the stadium. It can act aggressively, and it can invade the field. We implemented the model in the NetLocal environment, and it's available in supplementary materials if you would like to play around with it. So for the simulations, we defined 3 types of agents, the regular supporters, the kinetic supporters, and the neutral spectators. And these supported either the home or the away team. These types differ in their average desire to belong. So we draw a value from a normal distribution, and the mean of the distribution is highest for the kinetic supporters, intermediate for regular supporters, and lowest for the neutral supporters. We also studied different seating arrangements for the agents in the stadium. In a random arrangement, the agents are placed at random spots, independent of their type. In the second arrangement, the away supporters at their own section of the stadium. You can see it on the right, and the rest is seated randomly. And in the third and fourth arrangements, also the phonetic supporters for the home team have their own section, where the third arrangements, only some of the agents keep to this arrangement, and in the fourth arrangement, all agents obey it. For the results, we first studied the effect of several management strategies. We looked at the influence of supporter fanaticism on aggression by varying the percentage of the phonetic type supporters. And this tests the effect of management strategies that lower the number of highly phonetic supporters. So you can think about stadium bans, for example, or restrictions on promoting group identification. We also examined the effect of where agents are seated in the stadium. And in the Netherlands, separating the away fans and the phonetic supporters of the home team in and sometimes even outside the stadium are quite common, especially for club football and high-risk matches. And in Europe, it's also club football that's most often plagued by aggression. Only separating the away team, on the other hand, seems more common in international matches. And finally, we test the model against a real incident that recently took place in a game in Nigeria. As you can see in the top left and the bottom left graph, we find that the lower number of phonetic supporters results in a lower number of agents that invade the field and a lower number of agents that leave the stadium. And on the right, you can see that the majority of the invaders is of the phonetic type. Next, we looked at the effect of different seating plans. And while it's common in club football, we find actively separating or allowing the phonetic supporters to sit separately results in the most aggression, especially when the home team loses. In contrast, placing all the agents randomly throughout the stadium resulted in the lowest aggression. But the flip side of this strategy is that the aggression that occurs more often involves agents of both teams. And this possibly allows for more dangerous confrontations. So based on this, we think that separating only by team seems the most promising strategy. Finally, I would like to show you a case study that we used to test the model. This was a match earlier this year between Nigeria and Ghana. And there's a strong rivalry between these two countries. And Nigeria unexpectedly lost the game, after which the supporters rushed the field, and this led to injuries and property damage. He used descriptions from social media and traditional media, and also photos and videos to identify several qualitative patterns in the behavior of the supporters. You can see here, for example, in this photo that most of the seats that you see on the stands are empty. Many people have left the stadium, and those that are still there are mostly concentrated around exit paths, like the stairs. You also see that about 1.5% of the supporters participated in the pitch invasion, and we estimated this based on a count that you see here and on the reported attendance. And looking at the model, we found that it matched many of the observed patterns in the real incident. When we set a strongly negative group event for the home team, so that is the Nigerian team here.
5 minutes.
An important deviation, however, was that none of the real Ghanaian supporters entered the field, while some of the simulated agents supporting the away team did.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So here's a video of the simulation. You can see in the bottom graph in the beginning, the perceived threat goes up quickly, and at first, mainly the home supporters with a really high desire to belong enter the field. You also see that most of the agents leave the stadium, but some remain, and they're mostly concentrated around the exits. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here because of the time. So for the conclusion, we introduced a method for how continuous variation in group identity can form emotional subgroups in the crowd via emotion contagion and the appraisal of group-related events. We found that crowd management strategies that lower the number of phonetic supporters or mixed phonetic supporters with other supporter types leads to less aggression. And the latter is surprising as it goes against what is commonplace in stadiums, in Europe at least. So this might be an interesting direction to examine further. The model was able to reproduce many of the patterns of the real incident, but not all. We hypothesize that this has to do with one or more essential processes that are missing in the decision making. For example, in the proposed model, the away supporters do not consider the risk of entering the fields, while they are clearly heavily outnumbered by the rival group and may get hurt in a real incident if they do that. So in conclusion, the model shows some promise, but needs further development and validation, for sure. So then for future work to eventually come to practical application, like predicting the risk of aggression in a game, I think future research should focus on maximizing predictive power of models that require only minimum input of data, and specifically data that does not violate ethical or privacy norms. And this is an important challenge in crowd modeling in general, as there's a lot of complexity in a crowd, yet it's both very difficult to capture all this complexity, as well as very invasive as it concerns personal data, like the emotional state of a person. Finally, we recommend that future work explores other forms of support aggression, different sports, and different cultural backgrounds. Also, the role of group identity can be explored in other types of crowds, like during protests, in the work environment, or on social media. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions if there's time left.
Thank you for the presentation. Questions? I have a question here.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Maybe I missed something, but in your model, how do you manage agent perceptions? I mean, if you take a single agent, does it always perceive all other agents? Is it always sure about in what team each other agents belong to? Maybe it can be unsure, maybe it can see only agents who are in front of him. How do you manage things like that?
Thank you for your question. So the perception in the model is limited by the distance. They have a set of neighbors around them that they can perceive. There's not a specific field of view. It's 360 degrees around it. And indeed, the perception of which team the other agent belongs to is always correct. So this is something that is probably not realistic, and might be something that's really interesting to explore further.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Yes, to complete the question, do you or why don't you use a contagious model? For example, if I'm close, now I'm close to some fanatics in multi-agent systems, so it's quite contagious, you know. Do you take that into account?
If I understand correctly, you're asking whether it matters what the distance is to the other person in how much contagion?
A normal agent which is surrounded by fanatics becomes fanatic?
Okay, so the degree to which someone identifies with a group is not affected by other agents in this model. Does that answer your question? Or?
Contagious model. You use it or not? Do you change the status of the guys? In fact, you understand what I mean? I'm going to the stadium. If I'm quite normal, I think. Not sure, but I think all the guys around me are all normal. So I will stay in the same state. But in another case, if everybody is completely silly, perhaps I will become silly also.
Yeah, so this part is definitely in the model, but it's in the form of emotion contagion. So you will be affected by the emotions of the others around you, and you will take up this emotion. That's actually really the core part of this model. But it's not so much your identification with the team itself that will go up during the simulation.
Okay.
Okay. So, thank you again for your presentation and your questions. Let's thank them. And we move to the last presentation. John Hatta?
Yes. Hi, good morning.
Okay. John Hatta will talk about the paper study of heterogeneous user behavior in crowd evacuation in presence of wheelchair users.
You can see my screen all right? Everything is visible? All right.
Yeah, it's visible. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So to start with our introduction, our study involves crowd modeling, where crowd modeling is important to understand simply due to the frequency of crowds in a variety of environments, since crowds are virtually everywhere. Some examples of these environments can include everyday locations such as malls, college campuses, and even airports. And understanding the complexities of how a crowd moves in various situations and environments allows for better crowd and safety management for these kind of events. Some other applications involved can be the design of architecture to better suit crowd movement. With this sort of safety and management in mind, it is incredibly important to understand specifically crowd evacuation, or how a crowd might react in an emergency situation, and what sort of variables contribute to successful and unsuccessful evacuations. Sort of two major disasters have happened in the past due to poor management have been the Hillsborough disaster, as well as the Mina stampede, which has led to a number of crushing fatalities for a variety of reasons. Our model specifically, excuse me. Other previous models in this domain have generally used homogeneous agents. We have found where it's apparent that people can vary in many aspects, especially physically. And one of these other aspects that have not been modeled previously is the use of wheelchair and wheelchair users. So in order to sort of address this gap in current research, we created a novel evacuation model in order to examine the effects of a heterogeneous crowd and environmental parameters, and finally, the presence of wheelchair users. So in order to sort of implement this model, we started with an agent-based model to demonstrate any effect that varying agent attributes would have on the overall crowd. The reasoning being that the aggregate behavior of these combined individual agents would reveal correlations between attributes and the outcomes of successful evacuation. We chose a simple environment that would properly house a large number of agents, roughly the size of 2 basketball courts or 32 by 60 meters in dimensions, give or take. The evacuation scenario would not involve fire or any other specific emergency, but it was assumed that these 400 number of agents would all be in a sort of panic state. Based on the previous research, we chose known behaviors to implement within each individual agent. This panic state is sort of a generalized behavior in literature that's difficult to exactly describe by many accounts. There are many individual interpretations depending on the work, but the effects can be seen through as a sort of breakdown of social order within a crowd that leads to a variety of social contagion factors. So in order to sort of implement this properly, we began with the field of view and herding, since those are more sort of distinct ways to represent panic. Field of view specifying that agents will only react and move according to what they're able to see within the range of vision, where our agents are using a typical 120-degree field of view based on empirical studies. The herding behavior is a sort of social contagion also seen, that is described as individuals following each other in various situations, regardless of known information. In evacuation modeling, this is typically due to low visibility and familiarity with the current environment. Physical attributes are the final set of attributes considered. The attributes themselves are based on empirical data taken from the CDC's anthropometric reference data. These are especially necessary to consider as collisions between agents who are evacuating in a panic state are inevitable as people are rushing towards the exits. For our agents specifically, we have wheelchair using and walking agents. The main difference between these are the radii, mass, and speed especially. In order to actually bring this model to life, I suppose, we used Uni 3D. For those who may not be familiar, Unity is a cross-platform game engine that is primarily used for game development and simulation. In order to sort of build the simulation, we used a combination of game objects and components to construct the environment within a given scene, which is the main current environment you would be working with Unity. The agents themselves use a combination of nav-mesh agent components in order to properly traverse the environment using specified targets in order to calculate their walking paths. The nav-mesh is sort of a walking surface that is calculated upon a game object, which essentially designates a walkable floor for our agents. The process of running the simulation is to sort of generate the scene, instantiate the agents with their various components, allowing for heterogeneity, begin the evacuation, and record the relevant data. The general process is that after instantiation, agents who are randomly placed without a collision as well as facing in random directions will attempt to pursue other agents who are attempting to evacuate or pursue the nearest visible exit. These paths can be recalculated per update call in order to address lack of visibility amongst agents once they lose line of sight. within their field of view. And so the actual experimental setup, we ran each parameter set 200 times. The parameter sets being a combination of agent, one moment please. Each parameter set being a combination of varying numbers of doors, varying sizes of doors, and the percentage of wheelchair users within the population. And sort of to measure the performance of our model, we measured several performance metrics. The first one being evacuation rate, which is a measurement of the number of agents exiting the environment per second. A related metric of just being the average time to evacuate, used along with evacuation rate to generally describe the effect of a parameter set. We used a rate multiplied by time in order to get the average number of agents by that timestamp. The more important one we were looking for is the correlation coefficient of the attribute versus time evacuated within our agent populations, which would describe the specific effect of each agent attribute across the parameter sets. And finally, we used a rate per door to better describe how the evacuation rate was additionally affected by the varying number and sizes of doors within the environment. So just moving into the results, after describing the metrics, we begin talking about the rate of evacuation and sort of the averages. The evacuation rate being based on the timestamp at which each agent is seen to have left the environment. As you can see on the screen, we kind of have a combination of some samples of the graphs. We have a combination of raw data and a linear regression of the raw data, along with the average time to exit for the various number of doors. The stored data examined include a minimum, maximum, and standard deviations to better describe the effects of the parameter sets. Some of the more interesting things we observed in the data were a higher than expected evacuation rate for specifically smaller doors, 1 meter wide doors, due to a sort of an effect caused by the collision of the agents within the model, where within crowd mounting, there's an effect known as a bottlenecking effect, where many agents or many pedestrians, what have you, will crowd around egress in order to move through it. But a larger number of people around a smaller egress causes a buildup, sort of a blocking in traffic. Within our model, due to our collisions, these panicked agents would be shoving into each other, creating that kind of that known crowd pressure, but it was forcing agents through the egress in a faster motion than was expected within our model. So that was an interesting thing to observe. However, the general effects of each parameter set were noted to be an decrease in evacuation rate as the number of wheelchair users increased, and an increase in evacuation rate as the number of widths and doors increased, as to be somewhat expected. Moving on to the correlation coefficient trend, we used a number of scatter plots to plot each attribute against the point in time that each specific agent exited the environment. The scatter plots were then analyzed farther to determine the correlation and impact of each attribute with the exit time. Across all coefficient trends, we found that speed had a negative correlation that farther decreased as more wheelchair users were added. We found additionally that mass and radii had nearly equal but positive correlations that increased as more wheelchair users were added. It is important to note that the correlations themselves are noted to be fairly weak, values between 0 and 0.3, absolutely. But given the previous findings as well in results, these small correlations are showing a much larger impact on wider scales and affect the speed of these evacuations. Speaking specifically to that, we used a student's t-test to confirm whether or not these correlations would be considered statistically significant. The table value used was 1.972 based on the 200 samples per correlation with a 0.05 probability, where our values in green indicate a probability of less than 0.05, and that we can reject the null hypothesis, green meaning the correlation is statistically significant. Values that are colored red mean that we retain the null hypothesis. Across all the parameter sets, we note that speed was most consistently statistically significant, and mass and radii were only statistically significant for larger wheelchair user populations. But we believe that further trends within these correlations require further examination without just speculating.
5 minutes.
Thank you. The behaviors are effectively validated by previous works, having been based on more empirical studies. Our model itself is internally validated by our consistency of our observed results, which is further reinforced by the number of agents as well as the number of iterations performed in our simulations. External validation, as mentioned by the previous sort of speaker, would be considered highly unethical, especially in our situation where inducing panic within a crowd attempting to flee a building would be, well, incredibly unethical, impractical. And anyway, sort of further complications sort of lie in the absence of models that don't consider wheelchair users, so that is also something to work on in the future. Sort of to wrap this up, we have presented our evacuation model to address both the gap caused by a lack of heterogeneous population evacuation models, as well as the models that include wheelchair users. Our major findings are essentially that agent attributes have a low but statistically significant correlation with the time it takes to evacuate. Larger wheelchair populations, user populations result in lower rates of evacuation, but larger doorways, egresses lead to a higher rate of deviation as well as evacuation rate. Within future work, we plan to use our model within more complex environments and expand the number of variety attributes that agents possess in order to find other factors that play significant roles in evacuation. Notably, one being that how agents stumbling and falling might better describe how evacuations are processed. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for questions, Matthew.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to come back to the behaviors. You have not said anything about the behavior except that you follow some previous works, but do you mean that you use Craig Reynolds' works on flocking, for example? They use flocking, your agents, to move?
I'm sorry, use what for the agents to move?
You do not understand? You do not understand or you do not hear?
I didn't quite hear you that well.
Okay, it's better now?
Yeah, the mic's fine.
Perhaps okay, I will talk stronger. I was coming back to the behavior,
right.
And I just would like to have some precisions about the behavior and to know if you use Craig Reynolds' works on flocking.
Greg Reynolds' works? No.
Flocking, he means flocking.
Flocking. Oh, I was hearing something else. My apologies. No, our work is not based on that. Our work is based on previous works done by Dr. Helbing as well as Dr. sort of George, where it was a combination of simulations using what was it?
And why don't you use such classical algorithm?
As flocking, algorithms have become more complex than flocking in more recent times. They've been moving on to one agent-based modeling, and especially very cellular automata models that involve social forces, which are mathematical described equations in order to sort of show the flow of a crowd. Why we didn't use that exactly was to better understand how individual agent behaviors within heterogeneity could be built up and expanded on to an overall crowd, which these sort of equations do not address, as they assume agents to be homogeneous, so that their mass radii, movement speed, acceleration were all similar across the entire population.
Okay. And I have another question, if possible.
Sure.
Many works have been done during the 20 past years about crowd simulation, mostly coming from Daniel Tallman, who have a platform called vCrowd, I think, if I remember, Demetri Terzopoulos, and also in professional platforms like Legion, which is used for train evacuation on trains. So, do you have few arguments to defend your platform? What are you able to do with your platform that we are not able to do with Legion, for example?
I've not personally worked with Legion. I'd have to examine it to better answer your question.
And by the way, another way to explain the same question is, why do you use Unity and you code all from scratch, as I understand, and why don't you use some crowd simulation existing platforms?
That's a fair question. One second. And bit of a cough. I guess I'd need more time to answer that question. I could be contacted later in order to better describe in a larger context why we did exactly what we did. The short answer is that I'm personally familiar as a Unity developer with using Unity, so building from scratch isn't exactly a difficult process. Compared to using previous works, yes, it is definitely more complicated than using something like Legion potentially. But
okay, perhaps you should have to highlight those points in the next presentation.
Sure, right, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, I have a quick question if possible.
Okay.
Or quick answer as well. If you assume, I think you assume that all the people was in panic state, right?
Correct.
What would happen, or would you be able to include some percentage, for example, of non-panic people? I mean, what would be, well, you assume that, you have that assumption, but or maybe it's my suggestion to be able to include some percentage we are not in panic, and since, for example, some behavior of the people is following, or even, I think, either an exit or another person, if some of them are not in panic, maybe that would help to evacuate.
Right, we're on the side exploring a solution where we have a certain number of quote-unquote leaders within a population who are not in a panic state, those leaders being sort of not necessarily specifically tasked, but have the sort of responsibility to help the rest of the crowd evacuate, which we're currently looking into that, I guess.
Okay, so thank you again for your presentation and answers. And I think this is the last session, well, the last talk, the last session, and last session of PAAMS. Maybe I want to thank you everyone, and I hope you, as I did, enjoyed the conference, social programs and so on, and I hope to see you next edition, and maybe, I don't know if you want to add anything else, or no, okay, so thank you again, and bon appetit, and we can see each other then in the...
Thank you.